Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment and let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. It was late, just past midnight. I had stayed at work longer than usual, finishing up some reports. By the time I got to the subway station, it was nearly empty. The air underground was stale, and the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly. I just wanted to get home. The train arrived with a low screech, and I stepped into the car. It was almost deserted, save for a few people scattered across the seats. There was a man sitting near the far end, slumped against the window. He was wearing a faded gray hoodie with the hood pulled up, but his face was visible. He was staring straight ahead, unmoving. I thought nothing of it at first. People in the city always keep to themselves. I picked a seat closer to the door, away from him, and settled in. The train jolted forward, and the rhythmic sound of the wheels on the tracks began. I leaned my head against the cool metal pole next to me, trying to stay awake. A couple of stops passed without incident. The car emptied out further. By the time we pulled out of the next station, it was just me and the man in the hoodie. He hadn't moved since I got on, still staring straight ahead. I told myself it was nothing unusual. People take late-night trains all the time. Maybe he was just tired or drunk. The train rattled into the tunnel, and that's when the lights started flickering. It wasn't unusual for this line. I'd seen it happen plenty of times before. The train swayed slightly as it moved, the light cutting in and out. When the lights went out the first time, it was only for a second. In that brief moment of darkness, I thought I heard something. A faint sound, like fabric shifting. When the lights came back, the man was sitting a little closer, in the seat across from me. I blinked, unsure if I was imagining things. Maybe he had moved when I wasn't paying attention. I looked down at my phone, trying to shake off the unease creeping into my chest. The lights flickered again, longer this time. The train shuddered, and I felt the air grow heavier. When the lights came back on, he was closer. He wasn't directly across anymore, but one seat closer, leaning slightly forward. His face was still turned toward me, but his eyes weren't visible under the shadow of his hood. My heart started beating faster. I told myself it was a coincidence. Maybe he had moved to get more comfortable. Maybe I was imagining things because I was tired. I didn't want to overreact. I looked back down at my phone, pretending not to notice, but I could feel his presence now, like a weight in the air between us. The train suddenly slowed, then came to a jerking stop. The lights flickered once more and then went out completely. This time, they didn't come back on right away. The car was plunged into darkness, and the only sound was the low hum of the train and my own breathing. I gripped my phone tightly, using the faint glow of the screen to see. I couldn't make out much in the dim light, but I felt a shift, a movement nearby. My stomach dropped. The darkness stretched on, and I didn't dare look up. I kept staring at my phone, pretending everything was normal, even though every instinct told me to run. The lights flickered back on suddenly, and I let out a shaky breath. When I looked up, he was in the seat directly across from me. His hood was down now, revealing a gaunt face with sunken eyes. He wasn't just staring anymore, he was looking straight at me. His lips were slightly parted, and there was something about his expression that sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't anger or malice. It was intent. I froze. My mind raced with excuses. Maybe he was just trying to scare me, or maybe he needed help. But the way he was watching me, unblinking, made it clear this wasn't innocent. He wanted something. The train remained still, and the lights dimmed again. This time, I couldn't stop myself. I stood up quickly, gripping the metal pole for balance. I didn't want to run. I didn't want to make myself a target, but I couldn't sit there any longer. The man didn't move at first, just watched me with that same unnerving stare. Then, as I stepped toward the door, he stood up too. Slowly, deliberately. "Hey," I said, my voice shaking. "What do you want?" He didn't answer. He took a step toward me. His movements were slow but purposeful, like he was testing my reaction. I backed up, my hand reaching for the emergency intercom near the door. "Stop," I said, louder this time. My voice echoed in the empty car. "I'll call for help." His lips twitched, almost like he wanted to smile, but he didn't. He took another step closer, his eyes locked on mine. I pressed the intercom button, but there was no response. I hit it again, harder this time, but the line was dead. Panic surged through me. The lights flickered once more, and in that moment of darkness, I heard him move again. When they came back on, he was even closer, less than a foot away. I stumbled back, my hand gripping the door handle. The train jolted suddenly, lurching forward a few feet before stopping again. The lights went out completely this time, leaving me in total darkness. I could hear him breathing now, slow and deliberate. I didn't think. I bolted down the aisle, stumbling in the dark. I reached the far end of the car, slamming my hand against the door to the next car. It wouldn't budge. Behind me, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing in the stillness. I fumbled with the emergency release on the door, my fingers trembling. "Why are you running?" His voice was low, almost a whisper, but it cut through the silence like a knife. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My hands finally found the latch, and the door slid open. I scrambled into the next car, slamming the door shut behind me. The lights in this car were still on, and I could see other passengers, 2 people sitting at the far end, their heads down, asleep or lost in their own worlds. I ran toward them, my breath coming in short gasps. "Help!" I shouted. "Please, someone help me." They looked up, startled, but before they could react, the man appeared in the doorway behind me. He didn't run. He didn't even look hurried. He just stood there, watching, as if he had all the time in the world. One of the passengers, a man in his 50s, stood up and stepped between us. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice firm. The man in the hoodie didn't answer. He just stared at me for a long moment before turning and walking away, back into the darkness of the other car. The train jolted again, and the lights flickered back to life. Moments later, it started moving, the hum of the engine filling the silence. I stayed with the other passengers until we reached the next station. I didn't look back as I ran up the stairs and out into the cold night air. I never saw him again. It happened on a Friday evening. I had just put my son to bed, and I was sitting on the couch scrolling through my phone when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, but I had ordered some things online earlier that week. Maybe it was a late delivery. I got up and looked through the peephole. A man stood there in a brown jacket holding a small box. He had a baseball cap pulled low over his face, but he smiled when I opened the door, keeping the chain latched. "Delivery 4. He glanced at a piece of paper in his hand. "Mrs. Taylor?" The name was wrong, but I figured maybe it was a mix-up with the delivery company. "I think you've got the wrong house," I said. He chuckled nervously. "Sorry about that." Could you just confirm the address? That's when I started to feel uneasy. The box didn't have a label on it, and he wasn't wearing any kind of uniform. I asked him which delivery service he was with, but he avoided the question, mumbling something about working with a third-party company. I don't think that's for me, I said, starting to close the door. His hand shot out and grabbed the edge of the door before I could shut it. Wait, he said, his tone changing. I think this might actually be for you. I froze. His smile was gone, and his grip on the door was firm. My heart started pounding, but I tried to stay calm. Let go of the door, I said, trying to sound confident. Instead of listening, he pushed against the door, hard enough to rattle the chain. I leaned my weight against it, but I could feel him testing it, trying to force it open. I just need to come in for a second, he said. His voice was steady, almost too calm, and it scared me more than if he'd been yelling. I'm calling the police, I said, backing away from the door and grabbing my phone off the table. He stopped pushing and looked straight through the gap. You won't, he said, his voice low and even. Something about the way he said it made my stomach drop. I dialed 911 anyway, but before I could hit call, he slammed his shoulder into the door. The chain held, but it groaned under the pressure. I screamed, dropping my phone, and ran to grab the baseball bat I kept in the corner of the living room. Stop it! I yelled, holding the bat in front of me like a shield. He didn't respond. The chain snapped with a loud crack, and the door flew open. He stepped inside, shutting it behind him, and for a second, we just stared at each other. He wasn't tall or particularly muscular, but there was something in his eyes that made my blood run cold. He looked determined. I don't want to hurt you, he said, raising his hands like he was trying to calm me down. Just stay quiet, and this will be over soon. Get out of my house. I screamed, raising the bat. He lunged at me before I could swing it, grabbing my wrists and forcing the bat out of my hands. I struggled against him, kicking and clawing, but he was stronger than he looked. He shoved me against the wall, pinning me there. Where's the kid? He asked, his breath hot against my face. I froze. Leave him alone, I said, my voice shaking. His grip tightened, and he smiled with this slow, deliberate grin that made my skin crawl. That's up to you. I knew I couldn't let him near my son. I'd die before I let that happen. Gathering every ounce of strength I had, I kneed him in the groin as hard as I could. He let out a grunt and stumbled back, giving me just enough time to grab the bat from the floor. This time, I didn't hesitate. I swung it with everything I had, hitting him square in the side. He yelped and fell to his knees, clutching his ribs. I didn't stop. I swung again, this time catching him on the shoulder. He cursed and tried to grab the bat, but I pulled it back and hit him once more, this time in the head. He collapsed onto the floor, groaning, but I didn't wait to see if he was down for good. I ran to the door, unlocked it, and bolted outside, screaming for help. A neighbor heard me and came running. I told him what happened, and he called the police while I stayed on the porch, shaking and trying not to cry. The man didn't come out of the house. By the time the cops arrived, he was unconscious on the floor, blood dripping from a gash on his forehead. They took him away in handcuffs, and I later found out he wasn't a delivery driver at all. He'd been scoping out houses in the neighborhood for weeks, pretending to deliver packages as a cover. He had a record breaking and entering assault. That night, I slept in my son's room with the door locked and the bat by my side. I don't think I've ever felt so scared in my life, but I'm just grateful we made it out okay. I had been job hunting for months when I got an email about an interview. It was for a position I'd applied to a few weeks earlier, some kind of administrative role. The email came from someone named Daniel Rowe, the hiring manager. The company, Bridgepoint Solutions, seemed legit. They had a basic website, nothing fancy, just enough to show they existed. The interview was set for 5 p.m. on a Friday. I remember thinking it was a weird time, but I didn't question it. The address was in the industrial area on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't far, maybe a 20-minute drive from my apartment. When I got there, it was already getting dark. The building was a large, gray structure, the kind of place you'd expect to see offices for logistics or manufacturing companies. The parking lot was almost empty except for a few cars scattered around. That felt strange, but I told myself it was because it was late on a Friday. I parked and walked to the front door. It looked clean and well kept, with a small plaque that read Bridgepoint Solutions. I pressed the buzzer, and a voice came through the speaker. "Come in." "Second floor," the man said. The door clicked, unlocking, and I stepped inside. The lobby was quiet. Too quiet. There was no receptionist, just an empty desk with a stack of outdated magazines. The air felt still, like no one had been there in a while. I told myself not to overthink it. Maybe they were cutting costs or working remotely. I took the stairs to the second floor. The hallway was dimly lit, and the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly. There were several doors, all closed. At the end of the hall was one door slightly ajar with a light on inside. A small sign next to it read Conference Room B. I knocked. "Come in," the same voice said. I stepped inside, and a man stood up from the table. He looked ordinary, dark hair, a button-up shirt, probably mid-40s. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You must be Emily," he said, holding out his hand. "Yes," I said, shaking it. His grip was firm, too firm, and his hand was cold. Something about him put me on edge, but I couldn't pinpoint what. Maybe it was the way he looked at me, like he was studying me. "Have a seat," he said, gesturing to a chair across the table. The room was sparse. Just a table, a few chairs, and a whiteboard with nothing written on it. No laptops, no paperwork, no sign of any actual business. I sat down, my stomach twisting. "So, tell me about yourself," he said, leaning forward. I started talking about my work experience, but he barely listened. His eyes were locked on mine the entire time, unblinking. He didn't take notes, didn't ask follow-up questions. When I paused, he just smiled again, that same empty smile. "Interesting," he said after a moment. "You seem very qualified." "Thank you," I said, forcing a smile. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, like he was sizing me up. The silence stretched on too long. "Do you live nearby?" he asked suddenly. That question threw me. It had nothing to do with the job. About 20 minutes away," I said cautiously. He nodded, as if that was important information. "Do you live alone?" Now I was alarmed. That had nothing to do with the interview. I laughed nervously. "Why do you ask?" "Just curious," he said, sitting back in his chair. His tone was casual, but his eyes were sharp, watching my every move. I decided I had enough. "I don't think this is relevant to the position," I said, standing up. "Thank you for your time." "Sit down," he said, his voice low and firm. I froze. There was no friendliness in his tone anymore. He stood up, blocking the door. My heart started pounding. I tried to keep my voice steady. "I think we're done here," I said, stepping toward the door. "You're not going anywhere," he said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a knife, the blade catching the light. My blood ran cold. "Don't scream," he said. "If you do, I'll make this worse for you." I wanted to scream, to run, but I was paralyzed. My mind raced, trying to think of a way out. The room was small, and he was between me and the door. "Please," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I won't tell anyone. Just let me go." He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped closer, the knife glinting in his hand. I backed up until I hit the wall, my breathing quick and shallow. Then I remembered my phone. It was in my bag, slung over the back of the chair. He hadn't taken it. If I could just distract him for a moment. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, trying to keep him talking. He smiled again, that same empty smile. "Because I can," he said simply. While he spoke, I inched toward the chair, my fingers brushing the strap of my bag. I grabbed it and yanked it toward me, pretending to stumble. The movement startled him, and he lunged at me. I screamed and swung the bag at him with all my strength. It hit his arm, knocking the knife to the floor. I didn't stop to think. I grabbed the chair and slammed it into his chest, sending him stumbling back. I ran for the door, yanking it open and bolting down the hallway. He was right behind me, his footsteps pounding against the floor. My heart was racing so fast I thought it might burst. I reached the stairs and practically threw myself down them, skipping steps, nearly falling. I could hear him shouting behind me, but I didn't look back. When I reached the lobby, I ran straight for the door, fumbling with the lock. He was halfway down the stairs when I finally got it open. I sprinted to my car, jumped in, and locked the doors just as he burst out of the building. He pounded on the driver's side window, yelling something I couldn't hear over my own panic breathing. I started the car and peeled out of the parking lot, not stopping until I was miles away. When I finally pulled over, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial 911. The police didn't find him. When they searched the building, it was empty, and the knife was gone. The company? It didn't exist. The website was a fake, probably set up just to lure people like me. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't gotten out of there, but I don't want to think about it. I was driving home late at night, a long stretch of highway that seemed endless. The gas light came on around 11:30 p.m., and I knew I had to stop. There wasn't much out there, just dark fields and the occasional distant farmhouse light. When I saw the sign for a gas station a few miles ahead, I felt relieved. The place looked run down when I pulled in. A single fluorescent bulb buzzed above the pumps, casting a weak light. There was an old pickup truck parked near the building, but I didn't see anyone around. The station itself was a small convenience store with large windows, though most of the shelves inside looked half empty. A man was sitting behind the counter, leaning back on a stool. I got out of the car and started pumping gas. The whole time, I felt uneasy. The air was too still, and the only sound was the faint hum of the pump. I tried to shake it off. It was late. I was tired, that was all. But then, as I was finishing up, I noticed a man behind the counter watching me. He hadn't moved, but his eyes were fixed on me, unblinking. When the pump clicked off, I went inside to pay. The door jingled when I pushed it open, and the man sat up a little straighter. He was middle-aged, with thinning hair and a stained shirt. His smile was too wide, too forced. "Evening," he said, his voice low and scratchy. "Hi," I replied, placing a 20 on the counter. Pump 2. He didn't take the money right away. Instead, he glanced at the door, then back at me. Travelin' late, huh? Yeah, I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. Just heading home. He nodded slowly, still not touching the money. Not much traffic out this way at night. I didn't respond. His gaze was heavy, like he was sizing me up. Finally, he took the 20 and rang me up, but he was moving slower than anyone I'd ever seen. He pressed a few buttons on the register, then stopped, looking over his shoulder. You need anything else? Snacks? Coffee? He asked. No, I'm good. Just the gas. You sure? We got fresh coffee in the back, he said, pointing vaguely toward a corner of the store. I'm sure, I said, stepping back toward the door. He didn't like that. His smile faded, and his eyes narrowed slightly. Wait here a minute, he said, reaching under the counter. My stomach dropped. I thought he was reaching for a weapon, but instead, he pulled out a cordless phone. He turned away from me and dialed a number, speaking quietly. I couldn't hear everything, but I caught enough to make my skin crawl. She's here now, he said. There was a pause, then, yeah, just one. Car's outside. He glanced at me over his shoulder, his expression blank. I tried to act like I wasn't paying attention, but my hands were shaking. He hung up the phone and turned back to me, his smile back but tighter now. Something wrong? He asked, his tone almost mocking. No, I said quickly. I should get going. Thanks. I started to back away, but he stepped out from behind the counter, blocking the door. He wasn't smiling anymore. You should wait, he said. You said you were tired, right? Could be dangerous driving like that. I'm fine, I said, trying to sound firm. My heart was racing, and I knew I had to stay calm. He took another step closer, and I realized how much bigger he was than me. No need to rush. Why don't you sit down for a bit? I got some chairs over there. He nodded toward a corner of the store, but I didn't even glance in that direction. I really need to go, I said, edging toward the door. My hand brushed against a display of chips, and the crinkling sound seemed deafening in the silence. He didn't move for a moment, just stared at me like he was deciding something. Then, suddenly, the phone on the counter rang. The sharp sound made us both jump. He hesitated, then turned to answer it. Yeah, he said into the receiver. His voice was low again, but I didn't wait to hear the rest. The moment his back was turned, I bolted. I shoved the door open so hard it hit the frame, the jingle of the bell ringing in my ears as I ran to my car. My hands fumbled with the keys, and I could hear the door of the station slam open behind me. Hey, he shouted. I got the door unlocked and jumped in, slamming it shut just as he reached the car. He pounded on the window, yelling something I couldn't understand. My fingers shook as I turned the key, the engine roaring to life. I threw the car into reverse, nearly hitting the pump as I sped out of the lot. In my rearview mirror, I saw him standing there, his face twisted in anger, watching me drive away. But then I saw something else. Another set of headlights appeared, coming down the road toward the station. A large truck, moving fast. It pulled into the lot just as I turned onto the highway. I didn't stop driving until I reached a well-lit truck stop about 20 miles away. I parked near the entrance and locked all the doors, my hands still shaking. When I looked at my phone, I realized I hadn't even thought to call the police. I reported it later, gave them the address of the station and described the man. But when they went to check, they said the place was abandoned. The building was still there, but the pumps were dry, and the store was empty. They said it hadn't been in business for years. I don't know who that man was or what he wanted, but I'll never forget the look in his eyes. And I'll never stop at a gas station like that again. We decided to go hiking on a Friday. It was supposed to be a simple weekend trip, just 4 of us, me, Danny, Claire, and Joel. The trail was tucked deep in the woods, far from any towns or cell service. Joel picked it because it was supposed to have some amazing views, and we were all up for an adventure. We packed our gear, food, and tents, ready for 2 nights of camping. The first day was fine. The trail was narrow, winding through dense trees, with little clearings where we'd stop for water or a quick snack. We laughed, took pictures, and talked about how nice it was to be away from everything. Danny was the jokester of the group, always messing around and teasing Claire about her fear of bugs. By the time we made it to the first campsite, the sun was setting. We set up our tents, made a small fire, and ate while the sky turned dark. That night, as we sat around the fire, we thought we heard something in the woods. It was faint, like a twig snapping, but it made us all stop talking. Joel said it was probably an animal, maybe a deer. We laughed it off, but I couldn't shake this uneasy feeling. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no crickets, just the occasional rustling of leaves. The next morning, Danny was gone. His sleeping bag was empty, his boots were gone, and so was his backpack. At first, we thought he'd just gone to use the bathroom or explore, but as the hours passed, we started to worry. Joel and I searched the area, calling his name, while Claire stayed by the camp in case he came back. There was no sign of him. No footprints, no gear left behind, nothing. By midday, Joel suggested we pack up and head back to the car. He said maybe Danny had gotten lost and somehow found his way back to the trailhead. Claire was panicking, saying we should call for help, but our phones didn't have any signal. We agreed to hike back, figuring we could alert someone once we were closer to town. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched. I kept looking over my shoulder, but every time I turned, there was nothing there. The trail felt different on the way back, like the trees had closed in. Joel noticed it too. He kept checking the map, muttering that it didn't make sense. The path seemed longer, or maybe we were just more on edge. Then we found the first clue. A water bottle, half full, sitting on the edge of the trail. It was Danny's. He had a specific brand he always carried. Claire picked it up and started crying, saying he must have come this way. But why would he leave it behind? Joel tried to stay calm, saying it could have fallen out of his bag. An hour later, we found his bandana tied to a low branch. That was when Joel started to get nervous. "This isn't right," he said. He wouldn't just leave his stuff like this. We decided to keep moving, faster this time, but the trail seemed to stretch on forever. Around dusk, we found his boot. Just one, lying in the middle of the path. The laces were still tied, but it was dirty, like it had been dragged through the mud. Claire broke down again, saying we needed to stop and wait for Danny. Joel and I argued with her, saying it was safer to keep going. We didn't want to be stuck out there another night. That was when we noticed something. The boot had marks on it, like it had been scratched or clawed at. But they weren't from an animal. They were too deliberate, too clean. Joel and I exchanged a look but didn't say anything to Claire. We just told her to keep moving. As the sun went down, we found more clues. A ripped strap from Danny's backpack, a trail of granola spilling across the dirt. Each piece felt like a breadcrumb, like someone was leading us somewhere. I started to hear things, branches snapping, leaves rustling, but every time I turned, the woods were empty. Joel was tense, his hand gripping the strap of his pack like he was ready to swing it at someone. We decided to stop for the night when it got too dark to see. Claire was a mess, whispering that something was wrong, that we should have stayed at the first campsite. Joel tried to reassure her, but I could see the fear in his eyes. None of us slept. We just sat there, listening to the forest. Around midnight, I saw movement. Just a shadow darting between the trees. I nudged Joel, and he saw it too. We didn't wake Claire, not wanting to scare her more, but we stayed up, gripping sticks like they were weapons. The shadow didn't come closer, but it didn't leave either. It just circled us, staying just out of reach. By dawn, we were ready to run. We packed up as quickly as we could, dragging Claire along as she sobbed. The trail was easier to follow in the daylight, but the woods felt wrong, like they were watching us. Then we found Danny's other boot. It was on the trail, facing us, like it had been placed there. Joel picked it up and froze. Inside was a piece of paper, folded tightly. He opened it, and his face went pale. I grabbed it from him and read the message. It was written in blocky, uneven letters, "You're next." That was it. We ran. We didn't care about staying quiet or conserving energy. We just ran, crashing through the underbrush when the trail twisted too much. I didn't look back, not even when I heard Claire scream. Joel stopped to help her up, but I kept going, yelling for them to hurry. We made it back to the car just as the sun was setting. The lot was empty, and Danny's car was still there, untouched. We piled into Joel's car and sped out of there, not saying a word until we hit the main road. We reported everything to the police, but they didn't find anything. No sign of Danny, no evidence on the trail. It was like he had vanished. They said it was probably an animal attack or that he'd gotten lost, but I know that's not true. Someone was out there, watching us, leading us, playing with us. And they're still out there. I used to work as a delivery driver for a company that handled large shipments. Most of the time, it was easy work: pick up the package, drop it off, get a signature, and move on to the next stop. The night it happened, I had one last delivery on my route. The warehouse was way out of town, on an industrial road that was mostly empty. I'd been there a few times before. The place was always quiet, just a few guys working late shifts, unloading trucks or organizing pallets. The package I was delivering wasn't unusual. Just a long, rectangular crate about 6 feet tall. The thing that stuck out was the weight. It was heavier than anything I'd moved that week. I had to use the dolly to get it onto the truck, and when I stopped at the warehouse, it took all my strength to roll it to the loading dock. The dock door was open when I arrived, but the lights inside were dim. I called out, but no one answered at first. After a minute, a guy came around the corner. He looked rough, like he hadn't slept in days, dark circles under his eyes, stubble on his face. He wasn't wearing any uniform, just a plain jacket and jeans. "You're late," he said, not looking at me. I told him I had other stops, but he didn't seem to care. He just pointed to the crate and said, "Bring it in." I pushed the dolly into the warehouse. It was colder inside than I expected, and it smelled bad, like chemicals and something rotting. The guy led me to a corner where a few more men were standing. There were 4 of them total, all dressed the same, jackets, work boots, no uniforms. They didn't say much, just nodded at the crate and motioned for me to leave it there. One of them handed me a clipboard to sign. I noticed his hands were dirty, like he'd been working with oil or grease, but there was something else on them too. Something darker. It wasn't grease, it looked like blood. I signed the paperwork and turned to leave, but one of the men stepped in front of me. He was taller than the others, with a shaved head and a thick scar running down his cheek. He didn't say anything, just stared at me. "I need to get going," I said, trying to sound calm. He didn't move. The guy who had met me at the dock walked over and put a hand on my shoulder. "We need you to wait a minute," he said. I told them I couldn't stay, that I had to finish my shift, but they didn't care. The man with the scar grabbed my arm and led me toward the back of the warehouse. I tried to pull away, but his grip was like a vice. "Just a minute," he said. "We need to check something." I didn't know what they meant, but the way they were acting made my stomach twist. They led me to a small office at the back of the building. The windows were covered with blinds, and the only light came from a flickering fluorescent bulb. "Sit," the guy with the scar said, pointing to a metal chair in the middle of the room. I sat. My hands were sweating, and my heart was racing. They stood around me, blocking the door. The guy who had handed me the clipboard opened the crate. I couldn't see what was inside from where I was sitting, but the others leaned in, murmuring to each other. "What's going on?" I asked. They didn't answer. One of them, a younger guy with a nervous look on his face, glanced at me and then quickly looked away. The man with the scar closed the crate and walked over to me. "Where did you pick this up?" he asked. I told him the address. He nodded but didn't say anything else. The room was so quiet I could hear the hum of the light above us. Then he leaned down, his face inches from mine. "Did you open it?" I shook my head. "No. I just picked it up like I was told." He stared at me for a long moment, then straightened up. "Good. Stay here." The four of them left the room, locking the door behind them. I stood up and tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. I pounded on the door, yelling for them to let me out, but no one came. I didn't know how long I was in there, but it felt like hours. I could hear faint voices outside, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. Then I heard something else, something heavy being dragged across the floor. I looked around the room, trying to find something to defend myself with, but there was nothing. Just the chair, the desk, and a filing cabinet. I opened the drawers, but they were empty. The door finally opened, and the guy with the scar came back in. He had something in his hand, a long, thin knife. My throat went dry. "You shouldn't have come here," he said. "I was just doing my job," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He stepped closer, holding the knife at his side. "Sometimes people see things they shouldn't. Hear things they shouldn't." I backed up until I hit the wall. I didn't see anything. I swear. He tilted his head, like he was considering my words. Then he smiled, a cold, humorless smile that made my skin crawl. "You're going to help us clean up," he said. I didn't understand what he meant until he grabbed my arm and pulled me out of the room. The other three men were standing by the crate, which was now lying on its side. Something was sticking out of it, a piece of fabric, dark and stained. "Get rid of it," the man with the scar said to the others. One of them hesitated. "What about him?" he asked, nodding toward me. The scarred man looked at me, his expression unreadable. "He's going to help." They handed me a tarp and a roll of duct tape. I didn't want to take them, but I didn't have a choice. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold onto them. They opened the crate fully, and I saw what was inside. I won't describe it. I can't. All I'll say is that it was worse than anything I'd ever imagined. "We don't have all night," one of them snapped. I don't know how I got through it. I just did what they told me, trying not to think about what I was doing, about what I'd seen. When we were done, They loaded everything into a truck parked behind the warehouse. "Now leave," the man with the scar said, shoving me toward the door. I didn't wait. I ran to my truck and drove as fast as I could, not stopping until I was miles away. I didn't go to the police. I didn't tell anyone. I just quit my job and tried to forget. But I can't. Every time I close my eyes, I see that crate. And I know they're still out there. I thought I was doing the right thing by hiring a nanny. I had to go back to work, and I couldn't leave my daughter, Ellie, in daycare yet. She was only 6 months old, and I wanted her to have someone who could focus on her completely. I used an agency that came highly recommended by a coworker. They promised their candidates were thoroughly vetted, with background checks, references, and interviews. The nanny they sent, Vanessa, seemed perfect. She was in her late 20s, with a warm smile and a calm demeanor. She said she had been working with children for years and loved caring for infants. She even brought a folder with her certificates and references during the interview. I checked the papers, and everything looked legitimate. I felt lucky to have found her so quickly. The first week went fine. Vanessa was punctual, attentive, and always gave me detailed updates on Ellie's day. She texted me pictures of Ellie smiling, eating, and napping, which eased my guilt about being at work. She seemed genuinely affectionate toward my daughter, and Ellie warmed up to her fast. But by the second week, little things started to bother me. One day, I came home early because my meeting got canceled, and I found Vanessa sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone while Ellie was fussing in her playpen. Vanessa jumped up as soon as she saw me, apologizing and saying she'd just taken a quick break. I brushed it off, telling myself she was human and entitled to a moment of rest. Then, I noticed Ellie was cranky more often when I got home. She seemed tired, and her naps were all over the place. When I asked Vanessa about it, she said Ellie was going through a fussy phase, which was normal for babies her age. Again, I let it go. The turning point came the day I forgot my work laptop at home. I came back mid-morning to grab it and found Vanessa in the kitchen. She didn't hear me come in, so I stood there for a moment, watching her. She was on the phone, speaking softly, but her tone was urgent. "She's gone for the day," she was saying. "I told you, it's fine. Just come later." "No, no one will know." I felt my stomach drop. She glanced over her shoulder and saw me standing there. Her face went pale, and she quickly hung up. "Who were you talking to?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She stammered something about her sister needing advice, but she looked nervous. I didn't believe her, but I didn't want to confront her right then. I grabbed my laptop and left, my mind racing. That night, I couldn't sleep. Something about Vanessa's behavior didn't sit right with me. The next day, I decided to leave work early without telling her. I wanted to see what was really going on when I wasn't home. When I got to the house, I parked down the street and walked quietly to the front door. I unlocked it as silently as I could and stepped inside. The house was too quiet. I called out for Vanessa, but there was no answer. Panic set in as I rushed through the rooms, searching for Ellie. I found her in her crib, crying. She was alone. Vanessa was nowhere in the house. I picked Ellie up, trying to calm her while dialing Vanessa's number. She didn't answer. I checked the baby monitor footage on my phone, and my heart sank. The camera in the living room showed Vanessa walking out the front door, leaving Ellie alone. I didn't know what to do. I was furious and terrified. I called the agency immediately and told them what had happened. They promised to look into it and said they would contact Vanessa. That evening, Vanessa showed up at my door as if nothing had happened. She had a story ready. She said she had stepped out to get the mail and must not have heard Ellie crying. I didn't buy it. I fired her on the spot and told her to leave. She begged me to reconsider, but I slammed the door in her face. I thought it was over, but it wasn't. A few days later, I noticed a car parked across the street. It was there when I left for work and still there when I got home. The windows were tinted, so I couldn't see who was inside. I convinced myself it was a coincidence, but the next day, the car was back. That night, I got a phone call from a blocked number. When I answered, no one spoke, but I could hear breathing on the other end. I hung up and checked the locks on all the doors and windows. The following morning, I found a note taped to my front door. It was written in shaky handwriting, "You shouldn't have fired me." I just wanted to be close to her. I called the police, but they said there wasn't much they could do unless she actually tried to break in or harm us. They advised me to install security cameras and keep an eye out. I felt helpless. The next few days were a blur of fear. I barely slept, jumping at every sound. I kept Ellie close to me at all times. The cameras caught footage of someone walking around the house at night, but their face was hidden by a hoodie. I knew it was Vanessa. One night, I woke up to the sound of glass breaking. I grabbed Ellie and locked us in the bathroom, calling 911. I could hear footsteps downstairs, moving through the house. The operator stayed on the line with me, telling me to stay quiet and wait for the police. It felt like hours before I heard the sirens. The footsteps stopped, and I heard someone running out the back door. The police arrived and searched the house but didn't find anyone. They said whoever it was must have been scared off when they heard the sirens. I moved out of that house the next day. I couldn't stay there, knowing Vanessa or whoever she was working with knew where we lived. I never found out what her real intentions were or who she had been talking to on the phone that day. All I know is that I trusted her with my child, and she used that trust to get close to us for reasons I still can't understand. It happened last weekend. I still can't believe how close I came to something awful. I've gone over it in my head 100 times, and I don't think I'll ever stop replaying it. I went out with a couple of friends to a new bar downtown. It was one of those trendy places with low lighting, loud music, and barely enough room to move. We hadn't been out together in a while, so I wanted to enjoy myself, maybe a bit more than usual. The night started fine. We found a small table near the back, close to the bar, and took turns getting drinks. The place was packed, but the energy felt good, not too overwhelming. I wasn't drinking much because I wanted to stay sharp, but my friends were having a great time, laughing and dancing. At some point, I noticed a guy sitting at the bar, just across from our table. He wasn't with anyone, but he wasn't drinking much either. He kept looking over at us, mostly at me. He had this steady gaze that made me uncomfortable, but I told myself I was overreacting. It's a bar, people stare sometimes. A little while later, my friends decided to hit the dance floor. I wasn't feeling it, so I stayed behind to watch our stuff. That's when the guy got up and came over. He smiled and asked if he could sit down. I didn't want to be rude, so I nodded. He introduced himself as Adam and started asking questions, small talk about the music, the crowd, if I came here often. His voice was calm, but there was something off about him, like he was too practiced, too smooth. When my friends came back, he got up and walked away without a word. It was odd, but I was relieved he was gone. Later, one of my friends offered to grab the next round, but I said I'd go. I walked up to the bar and stood in the only open spot, next to Adam. I didn't even notice him at first. He acted surprised to see me, like it was a coincidence. He leaned in closer, saying something about how the bar was too crowded and asking what I was drinking. I didn't want to engage, so I just smiled politely and looked away. When the bartender handed me my drink, I saw Adam out of the corner of my eye. He was quick, too quick. He reached over, his hand brushing against my glass for barely a second. I froze. My brain told me what I saw, but it didn't feel real. He had slipped something into my drink. I didn't touch it. I just stood there, staring at it, my heart racing. Adam noticed. His expression changed, just for a moment. It was subtle, but I saw the shift in his face, like he knew I'd caught him. I didn't say anything. I grabbed the drink, acting normal, and walked back to the table. My hands were shaking. I set it down and told my friends I needed some air. Outside, the cool night air hit me, and I felt a bit steadier. I called one of my friends and told her what happened. She came out right away, and we decided to leave. As we were walking to the car, I glanced back toward the bar. Adam was standing at the entrance, watching us. I grabbed my friend's arm and told her to hurry. We got in the car and drove off. I thought that was the end of it. I couldn't have been more wrong. When I got home, I checked all the doors and windows twice. My apartment isn't in a bad area, but I still felt uneasy. I couldn't shake the image of Adam's face, the way he looked at me. It was around midnight when I heard the first sound, a faint tapping at the front door. I froze, my chest tightening. It wasn't loud, just a soft, deliberate tap. I crept to the door and looked through the peephole. No one was there. I told myself it was nothing, maybe just the wind. But then I heard it again, louder this time. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. I called my friend, whispering into the phone. She told me to stay on the line while she called the police. The tapping turned into a knock. Not frantic, just steady, like whoever it was knew I was there. I grabbed a kitchen knife and backed away from the door, keeping the phone pressed to my ear. My friend was panicking, asking if I could see anyone. And then I heard a voice. "Hey," it said, muffled through the door. "It's me, Adam. I think you left something at the bar." My blood ran cold. How did he know where I lived? I didn't respond. I didn't move. "I just want to talk," he said, his voice calm, almost friendly. "Come on, open the door." I stayed silent. The knocking stopped. For a few minutes, there was nothing but silence. I thought maybe he had left, but then I heard something outside the living room window. I turned off the lights and crouched down, peeking through the blinds. Adam was standing there, staring in, his face partially lit by the street lamp. He didn't say anything, didn't move. He just stared, like he was waiting for me to break. The police arrived 10 minutes later, though it felt like hours. I saw their car pull up, the red and blue lights flashing. Adam bolted. The officers searched the area but didn't find him. They said they'd patrol the neighborhood for the rest of the night and told me to stay somewhere else if I didn't feel safe. I stayed with my friend that night, but I couldn't sleep. I kept wondering how he found me, what he would have done if I hadn't noticed him at the bar. The police said there wasn't much they could do unless he came back. I've since changed my locks, installed security cameras, and started carrying pepper spray. I still don't know if he'll come back, but I'm trying to be prepared if he does. I don't think I'll ever feel completely safe again. I'm a bus driver, been doing it for a few years now. I've always kept to myself, focused on the job. The route I drive isn't anything special. It's mostly local commuters, a few regulars, some tourists. I've gotten used to the faces, the people who get on and off at their usual stops. It's a predictable job, and I liked it that way. That was, until I noticed him. It started out normal enough, just another day at the wheel, but there was this one guy. He was tall, maybe in his late 30s or early 40s, always wearing a jacket and jeans, even on the hottest days. I couldn't tell much about his face. He always kept his head down, usually staring at his phone or a book, but I'd see him from the rearview mirror. At first, I thought nothing of it. But then it became weird. Every time I looked in the mirror, I'd see him sitting in the same seat, right near the back, a few rows from the exit. He'd get on the bus at the same stop, at the same time, and he never got off. The other passengers would get off at their stops, a few people would board, but this man? He stayed. He stayed for the whole route. At first, I thought maybe he had nowhere to go or was just lost in thought. But after a few days of it, I started getting this feeling in the pit of my stomach. He never spoke to anyone. He never even moved from that seat unless the bus made a stop. And even then, it was just a slight shift in his posture, as if he was making sure no one took the seat beside him. One night, I was driving the last shift, and I noticed that he was still there, sitting in the back. The bus had emptied out, everyone else had gotten off, but not him. I was doing my usual check, making sure no one had left anything behind, when I glanced in the mirror. He was watching me. Not in a subtle way, but in a way that felt almost too obvious. I looked away, pretending I didn't notice, but I could feel his eyes on me. The thing is, I wasn't sure what made me more uncomfortable, the fact that he was still there, or the fact that I couldn't remember when I had started noticing him. The next day, I was on the same shift, driving the same route. There he was again. Same jacket, same spot. It was like clockwork. I didn't think much of it at first, but this time, I could see him watching me more closely, almost like he was waiting for something. His eyes weren't wandering like they usually did. They were fixed, staring straight at me through the rearview mirror. I tried not to let it get to me. I told myself it was nothing. But by the third day, I was starting to feel paranoid. He hadn't missed a single shift, and he hadn't gotten off once. One afternoon, I decided to take a different route. It wasn't a big change, just a small detour, but enough that it would make the ride a little longer. The guy didn't budge. He was still sitting in the same spot, his eyes still locked on me through the rearview mirror. It made my skin crawl. The last stop before I was supposed to turn around is always quiet, a residential area, usually just a couple people getting on or off. But that day, when I glanced up at the rearview, I saw him stand up. I didn't think much of it at first. I thought he was finally getting off, but then he just walked to the front of the bus. I stopped the bus, confused. I waited for him to get off, but he just stood there. Not looking out the window, not doing anything. He was just standing there, staring at me. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to sound casual. No answer. He just stood there, staring. The moment felt like it stretched on forever. I felt a cold sweat forming on my back, a nervous knot in my stomach. Why wasn't he leaving? Why wasn't he getting off the bus? Is there a problem? I asked again, my voice a little shaky. He didn't speak. He just took a step closer, moving toward the driver's seat. "Hey," I said, trying to stay calm, "you need to sit down." But he didn't listen. He was almost beside me now, and I could smell his cologne, something cheap, overpowering. I could feel him right behind me. Then, just as I was about to say something else, he spoke. "You're driving the wrong way," he said, his voice low, almost too quiet for me to hear over the hum of the bus engine. I didn't know what to say. What? I stammered. He leaned closer, and I could see the faintest smile on his face. "You're supposed to go the other way," he said again. The tone in his voice, the calmness, made my chest tighten. I didn't know what he meant, or if he was just messing with me, but I could feel something wasn't right. I pulled the bus over to the side of the road, pretending to check the route. He still didn't move, still standing next to me, watching. I could hear his breath now, soft and steady. And that's when I saw it, something glinting in his hand. A knife. My heart stopped. I froze, too scared to move, but just enough awareness in me to know that I had to act fast. "Is there something I can help you with?" I asked, trying to sound calm but failing miserably. He didn't answer, just kept his eyes locked on mine, his grip tightening around the knife. I knew I had only one option: get away. I made a snap decision. I grabbed the radio, hit the button, and called for help. It wasn't until I saw his face change, his eyes narrowing, that I realized what had just happened. He knew. He knew I'd called for help. I wasn't sure if he was going to attack or leave, but when I heard sirens in the distance, he made a sharp turn and bolted off the bus without a word. I didn't wait. I locked the doors, called the police, and stayed in that bus until they arrived. They found nothing when they searched the area. No trace of the guy. I'm still driving, but I haven't seen him since that night. Every time I look in the rearview mirror now, I feel like I'm waiting for him to be there. Just sitting in that same spot, staring at me. But every day, he's not. It was a Saturday morning when my fiancée and I decided to go check out this house we found online. The listing looked great, spacious, affordable, and in a decent area. We had been looking for a while, and everything about this house seemed perfect. The listing photos were all bright, airy rooms, and the backyard was exactly what we wanted. I was excited, and my fiancée, Sarah, was too. We were getting serious about settling down, and this place could be the one. We arrived at the address a little early, parked, and waited in the car for a few minutes. It wasn't a very busy area. Just a quiet street with houses spaced out, a little too quiet for my taste, but it didn't bother me. We went up to the front door, and I rang the bell. I looked around while we waited for the realtor. The house itself was nice from the outside, big, with a porch, a two-car garage. A couple of bushes near the front door, a few trees around the yard. The kind of house you could see yourself living in. The door opened after a few moments, but no one was there. I thought maybe the realtor had just been in the back, getting ready or something. I stepped forward and looked inside. The house was dark inside. There were no lights on, but the door was open just wide enough for me to see the hallway. I called out, "Hello?" No answer. I looked at Sarah, who was standing next to me. "Maybe we're early," she suggested. I shrugged. "Could be. I'll wait a couple minutes." We both stood there in the silence, waiting for someone to come to the door. But after another minute or so, I started to get the feeling something wasn't quite right. It wasn't like the place was abandoned. The door was unlocked, but the house still had furniture in it, like it was ready for showings. I was about to turn around and call the real estate agency when I heard a noise inside, faint footsteps, like someone moving in the other room. "Hello?" I called again, a little louder this time. Nothing. I pushed the door open slightly and peeked inside. The house was old, but clean, well maintained. There were a few pieces of furniture scattered around, a couch here, a coffee table there, but it looked like it had been staged for a showing. Nothing too personal or too lived in. Just the bare essentials to make it look homey. But still, it felt off. I stepped inside and looked around. The air smelled faintly of something sweet, like cinnamon, but it felt stale, almost like no one had been in the house for a while. I glanced over at Sarah, who was still standing by the door, looking hesitant. "We should go back to the car and call the agency," Sarah said, looking uneasy. Maybe they forgot about the appointment. Before I could respond, I heard it again, the soft sound of footsteps, coming from upstairs this time. "Did you hear that?" I asked, turning to Sarah. She nodded, wide-eyed. "I'm not going upstairs alone," she said, voice trembling. "Neither am I replied. But I wasn't sure what to do next. We could leave, but something about the situation had me frozen, like I couldn't quite put my finger on why it felt wrong, but it did. We both stood there, not moving, until I heard the footsteps again. This time they were louder, more deliberate. And then, they stopped. I swallowed hard. "I think we should check it out." "What?" Sarah said, staring at me like I had lost my mind. "I don't know," I said, my voice shaky. I feel like we should see what's going on." Sarah looked at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, but I'm not going first." We cautiously made our way toward the stairs. I didn't know what I was expecting, but I kept waiting for someone to step out, for a realtor to greet us, or for someone to explain the situation. When we reached the top of the stairs, we were hit by a strong smell, something metallic. Almost like blood. I gagged at the scent, but tried to ignore it. At the top of the stairs, there were 2 doors. One was closed, but the other was slightly ajar. I pushed it open slowly, holding my breath. What I saw made my stomach drop. The room was set up like a normal bedroom, except it wasn't. There were strange marks on the floor, like something heavy had been dragged across it. A large rug was pulled to the side, revealing a section of the floor that had been scratched up. My heart was racing now, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I heard a noise from behind me and turned. Sarah was still standing in the hallway, but she looked pale. I took a step back toward her. "We need to leave now," I said. But as I turned to go, my foot caught on something. I looked down, and that's when I saw it, a small piece of rope. It was thin, but strong. The kind of rope you'd use to tie something up. I pulled on it, and the floorboard beneath me creaked, like something was being dragged under it. I felt like I was suffocating. "This is all wrong," I muttered. I backed away from the room and turned to Sarah. "We need to call the police. This place it's a trap." As I started toward the stairs, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The door to the master bedroom was open, and the closet door was hanging half off its hinges. Inside, I could see the faint outline of a bag, but it wasn't just any bag, it was a large, heavy-duty duffel bag. My heart pounded, and my instinct screamed at me to run. "We need to get out of here, now," I whispered to Sarah, grabbing her by the arm and pulling her toward the stairs. As we rushed toward the front door, I glanced back at the living room. The house was eerily silent. No sign of anyone, but the feeling that we weren't alone lingered. We got to the front door, but just as I reached for the handle, the door slammed shut. I turned to Sarah, panic setting in. "What the hell?" The sound of footsteps echoed from upstairs. Heavy, deliberate. Someone was coming. I didn't wait. I grabbed the handle again and yanked as hard as I could, throwing open the door. We ran out of the house and didn't look back. We didn't stop until we were in the car, and I drove as fast as I could, not saying a word. When we got to the nearest police station, we told them everything. They sent a team to check the house, but by the time they arrived, the place was completely empty. No sign of anyone. They told us there were no records of the house being on the market at all. The agency we contacted, they said they had no idea who the realtor was. It was as if everything about the house had been fabricated. I don't know who set that trap or what they were planning to do, but I know one thing for sure: we were lucky to get out of there alive. We moved into our new house in early spring. It wasn't the kind of neighborhood you'd expect to find a house like ours in, but the price was right, and the house had everything we needed. The kids were excited, and my wife, Liz, was looking forward to making a fresh start after the chaos of the past year. We'd been through a lot, moving to a new town, settling into a new job, all that, but it felt like this could be a new chapter for us. At first, everything seemed perfect. The neighbors were friendly, and the kids quickly made friends with some of the other children in the area. Liz met a few of the local moms, and they were eager to have her over for coffee. It felt like the kind of place where people looked out for each other, which was exactly what we needed. But there was one neighbor, the one next door, who gave me a bad feeling from the start. His name was Doug. He lived alone, which I didn't think much of at first, but there was something unsettling about him. He always seemed to be watching us, even when we weren't doing anything out of the ordinary. The first time we met him, he just walked across the yard to introduce himself, but he stood there too long, staring at me and Liz with this strange smile. I chalked it up to being awkward, but it stuck with me. At first, it wasn't anything major, just small things. He'd wave from his porch, but then stand there staring while we got the kids into the car. He'd be outside when I came home from work, as if he had been waiting for me to pull into the driveway. He'd strike up these long, drawn-out conversations about the weather, or the neighborhood, or whatever. I tried to be polite, but it was like he was trying too hard to insert himself into our lives. Liz started to notice it too. She'd mention how strange it was that Doug seemed to always be home whenever we were, like he was watching for when we'd come outside. She made a joke about it at first, but then she started to get uncomfortable. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe I was overthinking things. It wasn't until about a month into living there that the weirdness really started. One evening, Liz and I were sitting in the living room, watching a movie. The kids were upstairs, and the house was quiet. Around 9 p.m., I noticed a shadow in the front yard. I wasn't sure what it was at first, but when I looked out the window, I saw Doug standing in his driveway, staring directly at our house. I thought it was odd, but maybe he was just taking a walk or something. I told Liz, and she didn't think much of it either. A couple of nights later, it happened again. This time, I went outside to check the mail, and Doug came over. He didn't even wait for me to come up to him. He just started talking, asking about the house and how we liked it. I gave him short answers, but he kept going on, telling me things about the neighborhood, about the previous owners of the house, about how quiet it was here. But he wasn't looking at me when he spoke. His eyes were darting around, like he was checking for something or someone. I felt uneasy, but I didn't want to be rude, so I just nodded along. Things took a darker turn the following week. Liz and I were getting ready to go out for a date night. We had hired a sitter, and everything was set. But when I went out to start the car, I noticed something strange. Doug's garage door was open, and his car was parked inside, but the lights in his house were off. The windows were completely dark. I didn't think much of it at first, but when I turned around to get into my car, I saw Doug standing in his driveway again, staring at me. I got this chill down my spine. It wasn't just a casual glance. He was looking at me with an intensity one hadn't noticed before. It was like he was watching, waiting. I rushed to the car, locked the doors, and started it up. I didn't say anything to Liz right away, but I felt the tension in the air as I drove out of the driveway. It was like Doug was waiting for something, like he had been anticipating my every move. I brushed it off as paranoia. We went out, but it was hard to shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night when we came home, the house was quiet, but something felt off. Liz mentioned it first. "Did you leave the porch light on?" she asked. I hadn't. I checked, and sure enough, the light was on. I went outside to turn it off and noticed that the gate to our backyard was slightly open, even though we had locked it earlier. I had no idea how it had happened, but that was when I realized something wasn't right. Doug had been at the center of everything. I couldn't prove it, but the sense of being watched was growing stronger each day. Liz noticed things too. Small things, like her gardening tools being moved, or our front door slightly ajar when we were sure we'd locked it. I started checking the windows and doors every night before bed, but it felt like no matter how careful we were, someone was always a step ahead of us. It came to a head a week later. I was home alone one afternoon, working from my office. I got up to make coffee, and as I passed by the window, I saw Doug standing on the edge of his porch, staring at me through the window. I froze, but he didn't move. He just kept watching, as if waiting for me to notice him. I pulled the blinds down quickly and backed away from the window, my heart racing. I grabbed my phone and called Liz, but she didn't pick up. I tried again. Nothing. Then I heard the sound of footsteps on my porch. I didn't have to look to know it was him. I could feel it. My blood ran cold as I heard Doug's voice, muffled through the door. "You're home alone, aren't you?" he asked, his voice soft, almost playful. I grabbed the nearest thing to me, a lamp, and I stood still, listening. The door handle rattled, and I could hear Doug's voice again. "I know you're there. I've been waiting for you." I didn't know what to do. I could feel the panic rising in my chest. My mind raced, but all I could think was to get out of the house. I ran upstairs and grabbed the kids, told them to stay quiet and hide in the closet. I didn't know if Doug had any intention of harming us, but I wasn't going to risk finding out. I called the police, my hands shaking, and within minutes, I heard their sirens. When they arrived, Doug was gone. They searched the property and surrounding areas, but there was no sign of him. They told me there was nothing they could do unless we had concrete evidence of harassment or a threat, and without that, they couldn't press charges. We moved out within the week. I didn't feel safe anymore, and neither did Liz. I don't know what Doug wanted, but I couldn't stick around to find out. After we left, I found out from a neighbor that Doug had lived alone for years and had a history of bizarre behavior. Apparently, he didn't like new neighbors moving in. They said he'd been trying to get the house next door to ours for a long time. I'll never understand why he acted the way he did, but I'm just glad we got out. Every time I think back to that house, to Doug, I can't help but feel like we narrowly escaped something much worse. It started out like a dream. I was living in a small town, fresh out of college, and I was desperate to find a place of my own. I didn't have a lot of money saved up, and the cost of living was more than I could afford, so when I saw the listing for a one-bedroom apartment in a good area at an unbelievably low price, I thought I hit the jackpot. The apartment was charming in its own way, old, but clean. It had hardwood floors, high ceilings, and huge windows that let in a lot of natural light. It wasn't big, but it was perfect for me. I was so excited. I reached out to the landlord right away. His name was Mr. Adams, an older man who seemed nice enough over the phone. He said he'd been renting out the place for years and had recently lowered the rent because he was trying to find a reliable tenant. The deal was too good to pass up, and after meeting him in person, I signed the lease without hesitation. The first few weeks were blissfully uneventful. I unpacked my things, arranged my furniture, and settled into my new home. Mr. Adams would stop by occasionally to check in, but it always seemed like he was just making sure everything was going smoothly. He never came inside, just knocked on the door, asked if everything was fine, and left. I didn't think anything of it. It wasn't unusual for landlords to check in on their tenants every once in a while. But then I started noticing small things. At first, I thought I was just being paranoid, but the more I noticed, the more it started to feel like something was off. The apartment was old, and there were a few creaky spots on the floor, but every now and then, I'd hear a sound, like someone shifting in the next room, or the faint click of a door opening. I assumed it was just the building settling, or maybe even the neighbors. But then, I started to catch glimpses of things that didn't make sense. One evening, I was sitting on the couch watching TV, and I got up to get a drink from the kitchen. I passed by the hallway mirror, and out of the corner of my eye, I noticed something strange. There was a small black dot on the ceiling near the light fixture. It wasn't noticeable unless you were really looking, but it caught my attention. I thought it might be a speck of dust, so I grabbed a broom to reach it. But when I got close enough, I realized it was a tiny black camera lens, almost hidden against the white paint. I froze. My heart skipped a beat, and I stood there staring at it. My mind raced. Maybe it was an old camera from when the place was renovated, I thought. Maybe it had something to do with the building's security system? But it felt wrong. Why would it be in the living room, pointed right where I'd be sitting? I tried to shake off the feeling, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. The next morning, I decided to do some checking. I went through the apartment room by room, looking closely at every corner, every light fixture, and every possible hiding spot I could think of. It was hard to tell at first, but the more I looked, the more I found. There was another camera hidden in the smoke detector in the bedroom, and another one tucked away behind a vent in the bathroom. Each one was tiny, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. It was like they'd been placed in the most inconspicuous spots, but they were there, staring at me, watching me. I felt sick. My stomach dropped, and my mind began to race. How long had they been there? How many had I missed? The worst part was, I didn't know what to do. I couldn't just leave. I didn't have the money to find a new place on such short notice, and I didn't know who to turn to. I didn't even know if Mr. Adams was aware of the cameras or if he was involved in whatever sick thing was going on. I felt trapped. I decided to confront him. I couldn't let this go on, not without answers. The next time he knocked on my door to check in, I didn't hesitate. I opened the door and asked him to come in. He seemed surprised, but he stepped inside. I didn't waste any time. I told him I had found the cameras, that I knew he had been spying on me. His face went pale, and for a moment, he just stood there, frozen. "I don't know what you mean," he said, his voice shaky. He tried to play it off, but I could see the nervousness in his eyes. I pushed further, demanding answers, telling him that I was going to call the police. But he just kept insisting that it was all a misunderstanding. That the cameras were there for safety, to monitor the apartment while it was vacant. He kept saying I was overreacting, that I was being paranoid. He told me it was standard for all his tenants to have surveillance for their protection. I didn't believe him. It sounded like a lie, and the way he was avoiding eye contact made it even worse. I told him I was done and that I was calling the police. But before I could reach for my phone, he stepped forward quickly, blocking the door. I froze, my heart pounding. "Please, don't do that," he said, his voice low, almost pleading. "Just let this go. It's nothing personal." I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. He was too calm, too smooth, but there was an edge to his voice that made everything feel wrong. I pushed past him, my mind racing. I wasn't going to stand there and let him talk me down. I grabbed my phone and stepped out of the apartment, calling the police as I walked down the hallway. The police arrived quickly, but by the time they got there, Mr. Adams was gone. I showed them the cameras, the ones I had found, and the evidence was enough for them to start an investigation. They combed through the apartment and found even more hidden cameras in places I hadn't thought to check. They didn't find Mr. Adams, though. He had disappeared. I moved out that same week, and I didn't look back. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was always being watched, even after I left. The police never found Mr. Adams, but they told me the place had been on their radar for a while, that he'd done this before with other tenants, though they couldn't track him down for good. I still don't know what exactly he was planning or why he chose me. But I'm grateful I found the cameras when I did. I'm just glad I got out when I did. I don't think I'll ever fully get over the thought of someone watching me so closely, every day, every moment. It's something that haunts me to this day. I've always enjoyed hiking alone. It gives me a sense of peace, a chance to clear my head. I'd hiked the same trail for years, a long, quiet path through the woods that led to a lookout point with a stunning view. It wasn't a popular trail, so I knew I wouldn't run into many people. That's how I liked it, just me, the forest, and the quiet. It was a late afternoon when I was out on the trail, the sun starting to dip low behind the trees. The air was cool but not too cold, the ground still soft from a recent rain. Everything was calm. Too calm. As I made my way up the path, I heard the sound of footsteps behind me, someone coming fast. At first, I didn't think much of it, assuming it was just another hiker. But the footsteps were too hurried, too frantic. I turned around. That's when I saw her. She was running toward me, breathing hard, her face pale and wide-eyed with fear. Her clothes were torn, her hair messy, and she looked completely disheveled. I could tell she had been running for a while, but the way she was stumbling, nearly tripping over herself, told me she wasn't used to being out here. "Please," she gasped as she reached me. "They're chasing me. I need help." I didn't know what to think. It was a strange thing to hear, especially in a place like this. I was just about to ask her who was chasing her when she grabbed my arm, almost pulling me off balance. Her grip was strong, like she was terrified of something or someone. "Please," she repeated, her voice cracking. "I saw them. I don't know who they are, but they're coming after me. I don't have much time. Please, you have to help me." I was taken aback. I hadn't heard anything about people being on the trail lately, especially not chasing someone. It seemed ridiculous, like something out of a movie. But she was so frantic, so desperate. It didn't seem like she was lying. "Where are they?" I asked, trying to calm her down, but she just shook her head, her eyes darting over my shoulder. "I don't know," she said. "I just need to get out of here." I hesitated. I didn't want to get involved in something I didn't understand, but I also didn't want to leave her out here, alone and scared. I told her to follow me. I figured I could get her back to the parking lot, or at least to a spot where I could call for help. We started walking, but she was still panicked, glancing behind us every few seconds, and I noticed that she kept tripping, stumbling. It was like she couldn't keep her footing. "I don't know how much longer I can keep going," she said after a while. "They're getting closer." "Who?" I asked again, trying to get more details. But she only shook her head. Just keep going. Don't let them catch us." I was starting to get a sinking feeling in my stomach, the kind that you get when something's off but you can't figure out exactly what. The more I tried to help, the more it felt like I was walking into something I didn't understand. We kept moving, but then I noticed something. A sound. A twig snapping. Footsteps. Not hers. I turned around, but saw nothing. My heart skipped a beat. It was too quiet again, the kind of silence that feels wrong. I took a step forward, my eyes scanning the trees. "What is it?" she asked, panic in her voice. "Did you hear that?" I asked her, but she wasn't looking at me. She was staring behind me, her face contorting with terror. "Move," she hissed, grabbing my arm again, pulling me toward a side path I hadn't noticed before. "Now! They're coming!" I had no choice but to follow her. She was practically dragging me by then, moving fast, her breath shallow. She was faster than I thought she could be. The side path we were on led to a steep hill, covered in thick bushes. It was rough terrain, and I had to keep my eyes on the ground to avoid tripping. Then, just as we reached a clearing, I saw them. 3 men. Not far off, coming out from behind the trees, moving like they were hunting. They weren't running, but the way they moved was deliberate, calculated. They were closing in. I froze. My mind raced. I had no idea who these people were, but something about their demeanor told me they weren't here for a friendly chat. They were here for something else. "Don't look at them," the woman whispered urgently. "We have to move." She pulled me toward a small cluster of trees. I tried to keep my footing, but everything felt like it was happening too fast. My heart was pounding in my chest. Then, just as we reached the tree line, I turned to look back at her. It wasn't just her fear that I was noticing now, it was something else. A shift in her expression. She wasn't looking terrified anymore. She was looking at me with something almost expectant. She stopped, her grip on my arm loosening. "Why are you stopping?" I asked, confused. She took a step back. "Because I'm not the one they were chasing." It hit me like a punch to the gut. My head spun, and I suddenly felt lightheaded, like everything I had just seen was spinning in front of me. "What?" I whispered, my voice shaking. She smiled, a cold, calculated smile, and for the first time, I saw it. It wasn't fear in her eyes, it was something darker. I wasn't being chased. You were. The moment you decided to help me, you walked right into their trap. It was too late to turn around. I felt something sharp jab into my side, and I collapsed, barely able to keep my eyes open. The last thing I saw before everything went black was her standing over me, grinning. I woke up hours later, back on the main trail, alone. The woman and the men gone. I had no idea what happened, how I made it out of there. But I knew one thing for sure, I never should have stopped to help her. It wasn't a coincidence, and I'd walked right into their game. It happened during a layover. I had a few hours to kill before my next flight, so I was just hanging around the airport, trying to pass the time. I'd been traveling for what felt like forever, and my head was starting to ache from the combination of exhaustion and the constant noise of the terminal. I wasn't in the best mood, but it wasn't a big deal. I figured I'd just sit and wait for my boarding time. I found an empty seat by one of the gates, just far enough from the crowd so I could have a little peace. I pulled out my phone, started scrolling through emails and news, trying to distract myself. About an hour passed like that, nothing eventful. I didn't even notice the man sitting down next to me at first. He seemed normal enough. He smiled and said, "Looks like you've got a while to wait." I nodded. Yeah, just killing time. I didn't expect much from the conversation, but I wasn't in a rush to be rude either. He introduced himself as Tim. He was wearing a business suit, probably in his late 30s, with short, neatly combed hair. He seemed friendly, nothing off about him. He was just another traveler, like me. He told me he had just come back from a business trip and was waiting for his connecting flight. We chatted a little about where we were both headed, and I assumed it was just small talk to pass the time. Then, after a few minutes, he asked if I'd ever been to the city we were both flying into. I told him I hadn't, but that I was excited to check it out. That's when he leaned in a bit, lowered his voice, and said something that caught me off guard. "You know, if you need help with directions, I've got some great local tips. I've been to that city a few times, and I know a guy who can really help you out. He's the best driver in town, doesn't charge too much, and he can show you all the best spots. It's nice to have someone who knows the area, especially when you're traveling alone." I thought it was a bit strange, but it wasn't like I hadn't heard similar things before. People in airports were always offering advice, and I didn't think much of it. I thanked him and said I'd probably just take a taxi from the airport. But Tim wouldn't let it go. He kept talking about how much easier it would be to get around if I used his guy, how much cheaper it would be than a regular taxi, and how much more reliable the service was. He even said that if I didn't mind waiting a bit, he'd make a call for me and set it up. I was starting to feel a little uncomfortable. I wasn't sure why, but something about the whole situation didn't sit right with me. The way he kept insisting, the fact that he was almost too eager. But I figured I was just overthinking it. I'd been traveling for hours. My mind was foggy. "All right," I said. "Maybe I'll take you up on that. But I'll let you know if I change my mind." Tim smiled, and that's when things started to shift in a way I couldn't quite put my finger on. It wasn't a bad smile, exactly, but it was too smooth, too practiced. "No problem," he said. "I'll just go make the call and we'll get you all set up. It'll be easier for you, trust me." I watched as he stood up and walked toward the back of the terminal, dialing something on his phone. I didn't think much of it, still half distracted by my own thoughts. A few minutes later, he returned, looking pleased. "It's all set," he said. "The driver will meet you right by the exit. He's expecting you, so you won't have to wait around." I felt a twinge of doubt but told myself it was fine. It was just a ride. I was being paranoid. Tim seemed nice enough. I thanked him, and he said it was no trouble, just doing a favor for a fellow traveler. I followed him to the exit of the airport, where I saw a man standing by a car. He was wearing dark sunglasses, even though it was still light outside, and he was holding a sign with my name on it. It all seemed so normal, so official, that I almost didn't question it. But something nagged at me. Tim stood there, watching me, his hands in his pockets, like he was waiting for something. "There he is," Tim said, his voice too calm. "You'll be in good hands." I hesitated for a moment, but the man with the sign smiled at me and waved. I walked up to him, told him my name, and he nodded. "Right this way," he said, opening the back door of the car. I was about to climb in when I noticed something odd. There was a faint smell inside the car, something like stale air mixed with cleaning chemicals. And the car wasn't a typical taxi, it looked more like a private vehicle, older, and there were no obvious markings. That's when I heard Tim's voice behind me, still too calm, still a little too eager. "Don't worry," he said. "This is the best way to go. You'll get there much faster, and you won't have to deal with the hassle of the airport." I froze. Something clicked. A thought flashed through my mind. This wasn't right. There was no reason for him to be so invested in my ride. There was no reason for him to be pushing this so hard. I quickly turned around and walked away from the car. The man with the sign started to follow me, and that's when I realized how wrong everything felt. Tim stayed by the door of the car, his eyes watching me intently. I didn't know what to do, but I knew I had to get away. I ran back inside the terminal, looking around for security, for someone who might help. The man with the sign didn't follow me, but Tim did. He was walking toward me, his expression hardening, no longer friendly. I made my way to the nearest gate, where a security guard was standing. I went up to him, explained everything as best I could, and showed him the man's picture on my phone. He looked at me like I was crazy, but when I pointed out that the situation didn't feel right, he called for backup. Turns out, the whole thing was a scam. Tim wasn't a fellow traveler, and the driver wasn't really a driver. They were part of a group that targeted people with long layovers, offering them rides that were just a setup for robbery or worse. They had a whole operation going, luring unsuspecting people with offers of cheap, convenient transportation. I never found out how far they would have gone if I'd gotten in that car, but I'm sure it wouldn't have ended well. I'm just glad I walked away in time. The rest of my layover was spent in a corner of the terminal, surrounded by security. When I finally boarded my flight, I could still feel the tension in my chest, the creeping feeling that I'd narrowly escaped something much worse. I won't be trusting strangers in airports again. Not ever. It was a job like any other, or at least that's how I thought it would be. The call came through on a Tuesday afternoon. The man on the other end sounded polite enough, though his voice had a certain edge to it. He told me he needed someone to fix a few things around his house, some broken windows, a door that wouldn't latch properly, and a couple of minor things here and there. He said the house was remote, out by the woods. He asked if I could come by the next morning. I told him it'd be no problem. The pay was good, and it sounded like a simple enough task. I had no idea how wrong I was. I arrived at the house around 9 a.m. the next day. It was the kind of house that looked like it hadn't been touched in years, but not in a charming, old house way. The yard was overgrown, the paint chipped, and the windows were grimy, half covered in dirt and grime. The air around the house felt still, like no one had been there in a long time. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. I knocked again, a little louder this time. After a few moments, I heard footsteps approaching from inside. The door opened, and there he was. The man didn't look like much. He was in his late 50s, maybe early 60s, tall but thin, with a rough face that seemed to have seen its share of hard days. His eyes were too intense, though. They looked like they were watching me more than they were looking at me. He didn't smile, just nodded and said, "You're here for the repairs?" I nodded, feeling a slight unease, but brushed it off. "Yep, that's me. You mentioned a few things around the house that need fixing?" He stepped aside and motioned for me to come in. Right. Just a few things. I'll show you around." As I stepped inside, the first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. I mean, it was too quiet, like the house itself was holding its breath. It was cold too, and not in the normal old house way. There was no warmth to the place, no life, just the smell of dust and something else, something I couldn't quite place. He led me through the house, showing me the various spots that needed attention. I didn't ask too many questions. I've been doing this long enough to know that not everyone wants to talk during repairs, and I didn't think much of it. I was just there to get the job done and move on. We went into the back room where the broken windows were. I started looking over the damage, getting my tools ready. The man stood by the door, watching me. I could feel his eyes on the back of my neck, and it was starting to bother me. "You okay?" I asked, trying to make some small talk. He didn't answer right away. Just stood there, his face unreadable. Finally, he spoke. "You'll be here a while, won't you?" I paused. "Maybe a few hours, yeah. I'll fix up the windows, then move on to the door. It shouldn't take long." He didn't say anything else. He just nodded, slowly, and stood there in silence while I worked. The more I worked, the more I started feeling like something was off. It wasn't just the house, though the house was unsettling enough. It was the way he acted, like he was waiting for something, or maybe watching for something. I tried to shake off the feeling. I was here to do a job. That was it. But I couldn't shake the sense that I was being watched. Around noon, I took a break to grab my water bottle and check my phone. No service, as I expected. The house was too far out for any signal to get through. I glanced around the room, and I saw that he had been standing at the door watching me the whole time. I caught his eye, and he didn't look away. It was unsettling. "You need something?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "No," he said, but his voice sounded strange, distant. "Just making sure you're doing it right." I nodded but didn't say anything. It was weird, but I kept working. I finished up the windows and moved on to the door, fixing the latch. It wasn't difficult work, but it felt like it was taking longer than usual. The tension in the house was growing, and it was harder to focus with each minute that passed. I finished with the door and turned to look at him. He was standing in the same spot by the door. He hadn't moved an inch. I felt a tightness in my chest, a sense that something wasn't right. I'd been alone in a lot of houses before, but never one that felt so suffocating. "All right, I think that's everything," I said, wiping my hands on a rag. "You'll want to check the windows and the door, make sure everything's working." He didn't move. "You're not done yet," he said quietly. I frowned. "What do you mean?" "I've done everything you asked for." His face changed then, just slightly. His eyes seemed to narrow, and he took a step forward, blocking the door. "No, you're not leaving," he said, his voice suddenly colder. I took a step back, my heart racing. "What are you talking about?" "I've fixed everything. I'm done. I need to go." "You're not done," he repeated. "You're not leaving." I realized then that the door behind him had been locked. I didn't know when it had happened, but it was locked now. The whole atmosphere in the room shifted. My pulse quickened. I tried the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. "Let me out," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. He didn't respond. He just stood there, watching me. Then he did something that made my blood run cold. He pulled out a small key from his pocket, turned it in the lock, and opened the door just enough to slip through. I wasn't sure what to do. My instinct screamed at me to run, but I wasn't sure how far I could get. I knew the woods were out back, but they were miles away, and I had no idea how to get out of the house. "I'm going to call the police," I said, my voice shaking. The man's expression didn't change. "No need for that," he said. "You'll stay here for a while. I've got a few more jobs for you." I knew right then that something wasn't right. The whole situation felt wrong in a way that I couldn't explain. This wasn't just about repairs. It was about something else, something I didn't understand. I kept my distance, trying to come up with a plan. I looked around the room for anything I could use. That's when I noticed the windows had been sealed shut, the kind of seal that couldn't be easily undone. I was trapped, and he was not letting me leave. I don't know how long I stood there, trying to think of a way out. Finally, after what felt like hours, he started to walk toward me. I backed away, and just as he was about to get too close, I lunged for the window. I don't know how, but I broke the seal and managed to pull it open just enough to climb through. I ran as fast as I could into the woods, not looking back, not stopping for anything. I kept running until I finally found a road and flagged down a passing car. The driver was kind enough to take me back to the nearest town. I never went back to that house. I never contacted the man again. And every time I think about it, I can still feel his eyes on me, waiting for me to make a mistake. I don't know what he wanted, but I don't care to find out. I got out. I was lucky. I still can't shake the feeling of unease that came over me the moment I walked into that hospital room. It had been a long day. My friend, Emily, had been in an accident, nothing major, just a car crash, but she'd been unconscious for a few days. The doctors told me she was stable, but I couldn't shake the worry that gripped me every time I thought about her lying there, alone. When I arrived at the hospital, it was late, around 9 p.m. The hallways were quieter than usual, just a few people here and there, some nurses passing by, a doctor with a tired look in his eyes. I checked in at the front desk, and the nurse directed me to Emily's room. She was on the 3rd floor, down at the end of the hall, in room 312. I walked toward the room, feeling that familiar mix of worry and hope. When I got to the door, I knocked lightly, just in case Emily was awake. I wasn't sure what I'd do if she was, considering she was still mostly unconscious, but I felt better doing it anyway. I heard a soft voice from inside, "Come in." I pushed open the door and stepped in, expecting to see Emily lying in her hospital bed, but what I saw first was the nurse standing over her. At first, I didn't think anything of it. I was tired, and it had been a long drive, so I wasn't fully alert. But as soon as I saw the nurse, something about her made my stomach twist. She was too still, almost unnaturally so, and she didn't seem to notice me walking in. The woman was tall, dressed in the standard blue scrubs, but she wasn't moving the way a nurse should. She was standing over Emily's bed, watching her closely, her hands hovering just above Emily's body like she was waiting for something. It struck me as strange, but I figured she was just doing her job. I cleared my throat, trying to get her attention. "Excuse me, I'm here to see my friend." The woman didn't react immediately. She only turned her head toward me slowly, like I had startled her. When she did, her face was calm, too calm. She gave me a small smile, but there was something off about it. "Oh, I didn't hear you come in. You must be her friend. I'm just making sure she's comfortable." I nodded, feeling an odd shiver creep up my spine. "Thanks for looking after her. I've been so worried." She nodded in return, but her gaze didn't leave me. It was almost as though she was studying me, like she was trying to decide whether or not she should trust me. The smile was still there, but it didn't reach her eyes. Something about those eyes, something cold, made me feel like I didn't belong in the room. Is she doing okay? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She's fine, the nurse said, her voice a little too smooth. We've been keeping an eye on her. She's resting. I glanced at Emily in the bed. She looked peaceful, but there was something about her stillness that bothered me. Maybe it was just the drugs, but it felt unnatural, too quiet, too still for someone recovering from an accident. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I felt like something wasn't right. The nurse had moved a little closer to Emily as I stood there, and I noticed that she had her hand on Emily's wrist. A little too firm for a nurse, I thought. Nurses are usually gentle when they check vitals or when they make sure a patient's comfortable. But this woman's hand was too tight. I took a small step forward. Are you sure everything is okay with her? The nurse didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned her gaze back to Emily, her fingers still pressing down hard on Emily's wrist. She's just fine, she said, her voice taking on a slight edge now, a subtle change that didn't quite match her calm demeanor. You should go sit down. Let her rest. I was beginning to feel uncomfortable, but I didn't want to make a scene. I moved toward the chair by the window, keeping my eyes on the nurse. As I sat down, I glanced back toward Emily. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There was a small, thin line of blood near Emily's mouth. I wasn't sure if it was new or if it had been there for a while, but it didn't seem right. I had been here earlier in the day, and I was sure I hadn't seen it then. I looked back at the nurse, who was now busy adjusting the foreline near Emily's arm. I wanted to ask what had happened, but something in the back of my mind told me to be careful. I wasn't sure what was going on, but I didn't like it. I stood up from the chair, my legs a little shaky now, and I approached the bed slowly. I'm going to check on her, I said. The nurse's expression hardened. I told you she's fine, she said in a low voice, her words clipped, as if warning me. I ignored her and leaned closer to Emily, gently brushing her hair back from her face. Her skin felt cold, colder than it should. And then I saw it, the faint bruise on her neck, right beneath her jaw. It was barely noticeable, but it was there. A bruise like that couldn't happen from just the accident, not unless something else had happened. I pulled back, suddenly terrified, and when I looked up, I saw the nurse was no longer by the forced stand. She was standing directly behind me now, so close that I could feel her breath on my neck. What are you doing? She asked, her voice just a little too low. I turned to face her, my heart pounding. I think you need to leave, I said, the words coming out more forcefully than I meant. The nurse didn't flinch. She just stared at me, her eyes colder than before. You're mistaken, she said, her voice calm again, but now I could hear something else in it. Something dark. You don't need to worry about her. You just need to leave. I backed up toward the door, my eyes never leaving hers. I don't know what I thought I'd do if she didn't let me leave. But the moment I reached the door, I swung it open and hurried out into the hallway, looking for a nurse or doctor, anyone who might be able to help. I didn't stop. I just ran down the hall, toward the nurse's station, where I found a woman sitting at a desk, looking through papers. I need help, I gasped. The nurse in room 312, she's not who she says she is. The woman looked confused, but she stood up and followed me back to the room, where we found no one. The bed was empty. Emily was gone. There were no signs of the nurse either. They found Emily later, in another part of the hospital. She was unconscious again, and the doctors said she'd been sedated. They didn't know how she'd gotten out of her bed, but they did know she wasn't supposed to have been moved without supervision. I never saw that nurse again. They checked the hospital records, but there was no sign of anyone by her name or description working there. I don't know what happened in that room, but I'm sure I wasn't mistaken. I know what I saw. I just don't know how close I came to something worse happening. It's hard to describe the kind of fear that settled in the pit of my stomach that night, but I'll try. It was a Tuesday. Nothing special, just another long workday that dragged on forever. Around 8 p.m., the city was plunged into darkness. No lights, no street lamps, nothing. The whole place went quiet, except for the usual sounds of people moving around, shouting, cars honking, but that faded too. The whole block went silent, like everyone was holding their breath. I could hear my heartbeat loud in my ears. I had been at home by myself, nothing out of the ordinary. My roommate had gone out of town for a few days, so I was alone in the apartment. I didn't think much about it, just grabbed a flashlight and set it down on the table to be ready in case the blackout lasted longer than expected. It was a hot summer evening, and the AC was out, so it felt like the walls of the apartment were closing in. I sat by the window for a while, hoping the lights would come back on, but nothing changed. Everything was still dark. I was starting to get a little frustrated, pacing around. I needed to check on my phone for updates, but of course, the service was spotty. Just as I was about to get up and go to the kitchen, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps. At first, I thought maybe it was just the sound of my own nerves, like the air itself was heavy. But then I realized it wasn't from the hallway or outside. It was coming from inside my apartment. My heart dropped into my stomach. I stood still for a moment, straining to listen. The footsteps stopped, then started again. Slow, deliberate, like whoever it was didn't care whether I could hear them or not. I froze. My mind raced. Was it possible that someone had gotten in during the blackout? The door was locked. I always made sure it was, especially with the city being as crazy as it was during blackouts. No one had knocked, no one had called. I hadn't heard a thing until the footsteps. The silence that followed was deafening. All I could hear was the sound of my own breath and the pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to do. If it was someone trying to rob me, they probably hadn't expected anyone to be home. But I wasn't about to just sit there like a sitting duck. I grabbed the flashlight and pressed my back to the wall, trying to make myself as small as possible. I barely dared to breathe. I could hear the faint sound of shuffling feet, moving slowly. I couldn't tell which direction they were coming from, but they were getting closer. I waited, hoping it was some kind of mistake, maybe just the wind. But the footsteps didn't stop. I wanted to call 911. I really did. But I wasn't sure if I should. The blackout meant no phones were working properly, and I didn't know if anyone would even hear me. If someone was in my apartment, I didn't want to give away my position by talking on the phone. The seconds felt like hours, stretching out in a way I couldn't explain. I could hear the footsteps now, closer, right outside my room. I swallowed hard, trying not to make any noise. They were getting closer, and I couldn't think straight. My pulse was racing. That's when the flashlight flickered. I cursed under my breath, praying it wouldn't die completely. I didn't dare move to check the batteries. If the flashlight went out, I'd be in complete darkness, and that thought was worse than any other. My senses were on high alert. Every sound seemed amplified. I could hear my breath rasping, my hands trembling around the flashlight. I had to act. I moved quickly, staying low and as quiet as I could. I didn't know where the footsteps had gone, but I didn't want to risk staying in the open. I crept down the hallway toward the kitchen. The flashlight beam was barely enough to guide me, but it was something. I checked the back door to see if I could slip out unnoticed, but it was locked. Not a chance of getting out without being seen. I felt a surge of panic. Was this a mistake? Should I have called someone sooner? Was I being too paranoid? Just as I was about to turn back to the front door, I heard it again. This time, it was clearer, the sound of someone breathing. Not far from where I was. I froze again. The breath was heavy, deliberate, like whoever it was just waiting, listening for me. My blood turned cold. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I couldn't let them know I knew. I had to figure out what was going on, but I couldn't let myself get caught. I moved silently into the kitchen, my eyes darting around, trying to think. I knew the layout of my apartment like the back of my hand, but tonight, it felt like a maze. I didn't know if I'd make it to the phone in time or if I'd even be able to use it. I moved toward the drawer where I kept a knife. Not to fight, but to feel safe. I didn't even know what I was thinking. Maybe I was just trying to give myself some courage. That's when the door to my bedroom creaked open. I nearly jumped out of my skin, but I stayed still, keeping my breath shallow. Whoever it was moving around. They were getting closer, and I had no idea what they wanted. Maybe they were looking for something, or maybe they were just here to harm me. I don't know how long I stood there, waiting, trying to keep quiet. My mind raced. What was going on? How had someone gotten in without me hearing them? What did they want from me? And then, just as suddenly as the steps had started, they stopped. Completely. I didn't know whether to breathe a sigh of relief or to stay hidden. The silence was maddening, but I dared not make a sound. I didn't even want to move, in case it made a noise. I waited. Minutes passed. I don't know how long, but it felt like hours. Finally, I made my way to the front door, grabbing my keys. I couldn't stay here any longer. I bolted out into the street, finally feeling the fresh air hit my face. I stood there, just outside my apartment, and didn't move for a while. I didn't know if it was safe to go back inside or if whoever had been in there had left. Eventually, the lights flickered back on, but I didn't go back in right away. Instead, I walked to the nearest open store, where I called my friend and told them what had happened. I was a mess, shaking, barely able to speak without feeling like I might collapse. I don't know if I was overreacting, but I didn't care anymore. I knew something had happened, and I couldn't risk going back in there alone. The police arrived shortly after I called them, but by then, there was nothing to find. No sign of forced entry, no sign of anyone having been in my apartment. The officer assured me it was probably just a weird coincidence, maybe something in the building's wiring that made strange sounds or the blackout playing tricks. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there, that they had been in my apartment, watching me. I don't know what happened that night, and I probably won't ever find out. But after that, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I moved out of that apartment the very next week. I couldn't live there anymore, not after hearing those steps, those breaths, knowing someone had been in my home, whether they had meant to hurt me or not. I was in a rush that day. I had just finished an important meeting for work, and I needed to get to my next appointment on time. I didn't want to waste time waiting for a taxi, so I opened up the carpool app on my phone and booked a ride. It was one of those things I'd used a few times before, but I had never really thought much about it until that day. The driver's name popped up on my phone, Derek. His profile picture looked like it was taken in a park, with the sun shining behind him. It looked normal enough. I confirmed the ride, and within minutes, I saw his car pulling up outside the building. When I opened the door and got in, everything seemed fine. He greeted me with a smile, and I nodded back, not thinking too much of it. The car was clean, a little older than I expected, but still fine for a quick ride. I didn't really pay attention to the details of his appearance at first. I just wanted to get to my destination and get on with my day. I gave him the address for my next meeting, and we pulled away from the curb. We started out like any normal ride. The usual small talk. He asked how my day was going, if I had any plans for the weekend. I didn't mind, though. I wasn't in the mood to talk much, but I gave him short answers. The ride felt uneventful. But after a few minutes, I noticed something. I didn't recognize the streets he was taking. At first, I thought maybe he was just taking a different route, or maybe there was traffic on the usual road. But the streets were getting quieter. The buildings were looking more rundown. We were moving further away from the busy part of the city where my meeting was supposed to be. "Excuse me, I think you've missed my stop," I said, trying to stay calm, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't respond immediately, just kept driving. The silence between us grew thick. I tried again, a little firmer this time. "I need to go to address." "You're going the wrong way." He glanced at me in the rearview mirror, his eyes catching mine. There was something about the way he looked at me that made my stomach twist. It wasn't that he seemed angry or even annoyed. It was more like he wasn't really hearing me. His eyes had an almost vacant look to them. I know, he said, his voice calm, too calm. "I'll get you there. Just a little detour first, don't worry." A detour? That didn't make sense. I had used the app enough times to know that the usual route was straightforward, nothing complicated, no detours. My office wasn't far from where I had been dropped off, and the destination was right in the middle of a busy part of the city. "Is everything okay?" I asked, my voice now a little tighter. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he just kept driving, taking a sharp turn onto a street I didn't recognize. I could feel my nerves start to tighten. Something was wrong. My instinct told me that I needed to get out of the car. I reached for my phone in my bag, ready to text my colleague or call for help, but I didn't want to make any sudden movements. I didn't know this man. I didn't know what he might do. "Could you stop the car, please?" I asked, my voice much more forceful now. "I'm not comfortable with this." He finally spoke again, but his tone had changed. It wasn't casual anymore. It was almost cold, like he wasn't speaking to a passenger anymore. "I told you, don't worry. We're almost there." That's when I noticed it. The neighborhood was getting worse. The buildings were crumbling, the streets were barely lit, and there weren't many cars on the road. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. This was not the area I needed to be in. I wasn't familiar with this place, but I could tell it was a bad part of town. The kind of place you didn't go alone, especially not when the sun was setting. I started to panic, but I didn't want to let him know. I tried to keep my voice steady when I spoke again. "I really need you to stop, right here. Please." He looked at me through the rearview mirror again, and this time, there was something off about his smile. It wasn't a friendly smile anymore. It was more like a knowing grin, the kind that made my blood run cold. "Just relax," he said, his voice low. "You're going to be fine." I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my hands sweating as I gripped my phone tighter. The fear was starting to wash over me now, and I didn't know how to shake it. I had been in uncomfortable situations before, but this was different. This wasn't a normal ride. Suddenly, he turned the car down an alleyway. It was so dark I could barely see anything outside. I was starting to feel trapped, completely at his mercy. I had no idea where we were going, and I had no idea how to get out of this situation. I tried to reach for the door handle, but the locks clicked in place. "Stop the car," I said, my voice cracking. "Please. I need to get out. Now." But he just kept driving. I could hear him humming to himself, the sound making the entire situation feel even more surreal. I had to do something. I couldn't just sit there and wait for whatever he was planning. I knew I had to act fast. In one swift motion, I unlocked the door and flung it open. The car was moving slowly enough that I could jump out without injuring myself. My feet hit the pavement, and I ran without looking back. I didn't care if he followed me. I didn't care if he came after me. All I cared about was getting away from that car, from him. I didn't even stop to check if anyone was around. I just ran. I don't know how far I ran, but eventually I found a busy street. People were walking around, and I could see a store with lights on. I ran into the store, breathless, my heart still pounding in my chest. The store clerk gave me a strange look, but I didn't care. I told them I needed to call the police, and they let me use the phone. When the police arrived, they checked the area for the car. They found it a few blocks down, parked and empty. No sign of the driver. They said they would investigate, but honestly, I was too shaken to think about it much more. I just wanted to get out of that area. I never used the carpool app again after that. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something worse. Something I couldn't even put into words. I still don't know what that man's intentions were. But I know one thing for sure, he wasn't planning to take me where I needed to go. And I'm just thankful I got out in time. It all started when we won that free weekend getaway at the remote resort. I know, it sounds too good to be true, right? We didn't think much of it at the time, and the email seemed legitimate. The resort was supposed to be this exclusive, private place tucked away in the mountains, and the offer said it was a special promotion for a lucky couple. My girlfriend and I were both working long hours, and the idea of getting away for a few days in a peaceful place sounded perfect. When we arrived, the place looked just like in the pictures, impressive, with wooden cabins, a scenic lake, and mountains in the distance. Everything was beautiful, but there was something off about it from the beginning. The place was completely isolated. No other cars around, no other guests. Not even any staff that we could see. But there was a sign at the entrance that said "Welcome," our names, with a big, bold arrow pointing toward the main cabin. I felt a little uneasy, but I brushed it off. I assumed it was part of the charm, remote, private, exclusive. The kind of place you'd only see in movies, where everything seems a bit too perfect. We followed the path up to the main cabin, and that's when we met them, Brian and Lisa, the couple who ran the resort. They were waiting outside the door, smiling like they had been expecting us. Brian was tall, with dark hair and a friendly face. Lisa was shorter, with short blonde hair and a warm smile. They looked like they were in their early 40s, maybe late 30s. They greeted us like we were long-lost friends, introducing themselves and telling us they were the owners. Brian told us how they'd been running the resort for years, and how they liked to keep things private and personal for their guests. Lisa was all smiles, offering us drinks and snacks as soon as we stepped inside. It felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on why. They showed us to our cabin, just a short walk from the main one. The cabin was nice, but again, a little too perfect. Everything was pristine, as if no one had ever stayed there before. The bed was made up, the towels were folded perfectly, and the windows had an almost unnatural shine to them. It wasn't the kind of place you'd expect to see if you were on a relaxing retreat. It felt more like a showroom. We decided to take a walk around, get some fresh air. The surroundings were beautiful, no doubt about that, but it felt eerily quiet. There were no sounds of wildlife, no birds, no rustling leaves. Just silence. We spent a good hour walking around, exploring the lake and some trails that led into the woods. It was peaceful, but not in the comfortable way I had hoped for. It was almost as if the silence was too loud, suffocating. By the time we got back to the cabin, it was nearing evening. We were supposed to have dinner with Brian and Lisa at the main cabin, but I started to feel uneasy. There was something about the way they looked at us. They were too welcoming, too eager to please. It felt staged, rehearsed, like they had done this before with other couples, except there weren't any other guests here. We walked back to the main cabin for dinner. When we arrived, Brian and Lisa were already seated at the dining table. They had set out a beautiful spread: steaks, vegetables, mashed potatoes, wine. It was enough food to feed 6 people, but there were only the 4 of us. The conversation during dinner was awkward. Brian and Lisa kept talking about how they loved having guests, how they were so lucky to have us there. But every time I looked at them, I could see a hint of something behind their smiles. Their eyes, especially Brian's, seemed too intense, like he was studying us, trying to figure us out. Lisa kept laughing, almost too much, at every little joke we made. I started to wonder if they were trying to keep us entertained, like they were afraid of something happening if we stopped talking. After dinner, they suggested we go for a nightcap in the lounge area. I agreed, though I wasn't sure why. My gut was telling me to leave, but I didn't want to be rude. I just hoped that once the night was over, I could go back to our cabin and forget about the weirdness. As we sat in the lounge, Lisa started talking more about the resort. She mentioned how it was a special place, and that they had a very small group of guests every year. That was when I noticed that neither of them had mentioned any other guests or staff. When I asked about it, Brian smiled and said, "We prefer to keep things private. It's just you 2 this weekend. We like to give our guests an experience they can't get anywhere else." At that moment, I realized that they were the only people here. That's when the feeling of unease turned into something more solid. Something wasn't right. I started to wonder if we were the only ones to ever win this free getaway, and if that was even true in the first place. The idea that we might be the only people they had in a long time made me feel trapped, like we were in a place where nobody could help us if something went wrong. The conversation turned dark when Brian began talking about the history of the area. He mentioned how the resort had been passed down through generations, and how not everyone makes it out of here. At first, I thought he was just joking, but there was no humor in his voice. His eyes were fixed on mine, unblinking, waiting for a reaction. Lisa didn't say anything. She just stared at her wine glass, swirling it slowly. I tried to laugh it off, but the air in the room suddenly felt thick. I wanted to leave, but it wasn't as easy as just walking out. I didn't trust the way Brian was looking at us, or the way Lisa's smile had turned into something too wide, too calculated. I realized that we hadn't even been shown the resort's other cabins, or the amenities. It was almost as if they didn't want us to see anything beyond this one place, this one room. The night dragged on, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. The longer we stayed, the more I felt like they were watching us, waiting for us to slip up, to do something they expected. I don't know exactly when it happened, but at some point, Brian and Lisa stood up, and without saying a word, walked toward the door. It was as if they had planned this for weeks, like they had been waiting for us to make the first move. As soon as they left, I turned to my girlfriend and whispered, "We need to get out of here. Now!" We grabbed our things and ran for the door, but when we reached the cabin entrance, it wouldn't open. The lock had been changed. We were trapped. I banged on the door, shouted for help, but the silence outside was deafening. There was no answer. Suddenly, the lights went out, and everything went pitch black. We could hear footsteps in the distance, echoing in the hall. I don't know how we managed it, but somehow we got out. We found a hidden side door and ran into the woods, not stopping until we found the main road hours later. I don't remember much after that. I was too scared to think straight. We called the police once we got back to the city, but by the time they arrived, the resort was gone. Completely empty, like it had never been there. Brian and Lisa were never found. The authorities said there had been no records of the resort even existing. To this day, I don't know what they planned, but I'm just glad we got out when we did. It was just supposed to be a quick trip to the grocery store. I had a few things I needed to pick up for dinner, nothing special. But that day, something felt off, right from the start. I parked in my usual spot, grabbed my purse, and went inside. The store was pretty empty for a Saturday afternoon, which was nice. I prefer it that way. I grabbed a cart and started down the first aisle. Everything was normal at first. I picked up some milk, then moved to the canned goods section. It wasn't until I got to the pasta that I first noticed him. He was standing a few feet away, not exactly close, but not far either. I didn't think much of it at first. It was a store, people shop, right? But then I saw him glance at me. It wasn't the quick glance you give to someone you don't know. It was a full, lingering look. I couldn't explain it, but it made my stomach tighten. I grabbed a box of pasta and tried to go down the next aisle, but he followed me. Not immediately, but slowly. I tried not to look back, tried to keep my focus on the shelves in front of me, but every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of him, still standing a little too close, a little too still. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. Maybe he was just another shopper, right? But it kept happening. As I moved, he moved. I went to grab some bread, and there he was, standing at the other end of the aisle, staring at the loaves of bread like he was waiting for something. I looked down at my cart, then back at him. He didn't look like he was shopping. He wasn't grabbing anything. It was like he was waiting for me to do something. I tried to shake it off. Maybe I was overthinking things. I walked down to the dairy section next, hoping to pick up some cheese. I glanced at him again, and this time, he wasn't pretending to look at the shelves. He was watching me. His eyes were fixed on me, and for a moment, it felt like the entire store had gone silent. I felt my heart race in my chest. I tried not to panic. I grabbed the cheese and then walked as quickly as I could to the next aisle. I knew I had to finish my shopping, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still following me. Every time I looked around, he was there, lingering, always just a little too close. It wasn't just coincidence anymore. I could feel my breath getting shallow. My mind raced through possibilities. Maybe he was just trying to get my attention. Maybe he was a little socially awkward. Maybe I was just being paranoid. But then I realized something. I hadn't seen him actually pick up anything. He wasn't shopping. He wasn't moving like someone who was trying to buy groceries. I had to leave. I finished up quickly, grabbed a few more things I hadn't even planned on, just to have a reason to head toward the checkout. I tried to act normal, but I couldn't stop glancing over my shoulder. Every time I looked, he was there. He was following me, and I didn't know why. When I finally made it to the checkout, I didn't want to seem obvious, but I couldn't ignore the fact that he was still near the back of the store. I paid for my things, trying to be as calm as I could, even though my heart was pounding in my ears. The cashier gave me a polite smile, but I was too distracted to really respond. I just wanted to get out of there. I walked quickly to the parking lot, hoping I was just imagining things. But when I stepped outside, I felt a rush of cold air hit me, and that's when I saw him. He was standing by my car, not too far away, but close enough that I could see him clearly. He wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. My legs froze. I couldn't move for a moment. He was standing just a few feet from my car, but he didn't seem to care that I had noticed him. He wasn't rushing toward me. He wasn't doing anything other than standing there, but I knew in that moment that something wasn't right. I felt like I had just stepped into a nightmare. I started walking faster toward my car, keeping my eyes on him the entire time. I don't know why I didn't run. Maybe I was too scared to make any sudden moves. But I was almost to my car when he took a step forward. Just one step, but it felt like a giant leap. I yanked the door open and jumped inside, locking the door as fast as I could. My hands were shaking as I started the car. I didn't look up. I didn't want to see him standing there. I just drove out of the parking lot as fast as I could, not looking in my rearview mirror. I kept going, not stopping, not breathing until I was safely on the main road. My hands were still shaking when I got home. I don't know why I didn't call the police. Maybe I thought I was overreacting. Maybe I thought it was just some weird coincidence, that he hadn't meant anything by it. But I knew I wasn't imagining it. I had felt the weight of his gaze, the unease that crept over me every time I turned around. It wasn't until I was unpacking my groceries that I noticed it. One of the bags was a little heavier than it should have been. I pulled out the items inside, and then I found it a small piece of paper, folded up tightly. I opened it, and it was just a single sentence, written in jagged handwriting. "I'll be seeing you again soon." That was it. No name. No explanation. Just those words. I don't know what that guy wanted, or if he'd been following me before, or if it was all some weird coincidence. But I haven't gone back to that store since. And I don't know if I ever will. I don't know if he'll ever show up again, but I'm terrified that he will. It was a late Friday night, around 2 a.m. I had just finished a long shift at work and was driving home, the streets empty and quiet, only the hum of my car and the occasional flicker of streetlights breaking the silence. I'd taken the usual route, the one that was closest to my place, the one I had taken a million times before. I was tired, probably more tired than I should have been, but I was looking forward to getting home and going to bed. The next few minutes are still a blur. I remember seeing the flashing lights in my rearview mirror and initially thinking it was just another car behind me, but the lights kept getting closer. I didn't think anything of it at first, maybe they were just going around me. But then, I noticed the car had no other lights on except for the flashing red and blue ones. It was weird, but it didn't register as alarming yet. I didn't panic. I just pulled over to the side of the road. The car that stopped behind me was unmarked. No police insignia or anything identifying it as an official vehicle. But the lights were enough to make me believe it was a cop, even though I could tell something wasn't quite right. The person who got out of the car was wearing a dark uniform, and their headlights illuminated their face just enough for me to make out the white shirt collar underneath. But he was wearing no badge. It felt strange, but I assumed it was some off-duty officer or maybe a state trooper. He approached my window and I rolled it down, trying to stay calm. I wasn't nervous at first. I'd been pulled over before, so this felt like any other traffic stop, even though I couldn't shake the odd feeling in my stomach. "Do you know why I stopped you?" he asked in a deep voice, leaning toward my window. I could smell something faint on his breath, but it wasn't alcohol, more like a faint musk of cologne or maybe a cigarette. I shook my head. I had no idea. "You were speeding," he said. "License and registration." I nodded and reached for my purse. I wasn't thinking much about it, just the usual stuff you do when you're stopped by a cop. I fumbled a little as I grabbed my license and my insurance card, handing them over to him. He didn't say anything for a moment as he looked at them. That's when the unease started creeping in. His hands were unusually rough, and when he glanced at my license, his eyes lingered on it a little too long. "I'm going to need you to step out of the car," he said, his voice suddenly sharper. I didn't question it. Maybe he just wanted to talk to me on the side of the road, I thought. It was late, and maybe he wanted to make sure I wasn't intoxicated or something. Still, something about the way he said it didn't sit right with me. But I was tired, and I didn't want to argue. I reached for the handle and opened the door. I had barely stepped out of the car when I felt a hand on my arm. It wasn't gentle, it was firm, almost rough, and it sent a shock of adrenaline straight through me. I stopped immediately, my heart racing. "You need to step away from the vehicle," he said, his tone changing again, colder. There was a shift in his body language, and for the first time, I felt truly alarmed. "Is everything okay?" I asked, my voice shaking now. "I mean, why am I getting out of the car?" He didn't answer right away. He just kept holding my arm, and the grip tightened. My mind was racing, and I could feel my pulse in my throat. This was not right. No officer had ever made me step out of my car like this, especially in the middle of nowhere. "I'm just following procedure," he said, though his words sounded rehearsed, like he was trying to make it sound official. But something in his eyes made my stomach churn. It wasn't the look of a cop, it was the look of someone who had an agenda. His pupils were too wide. His breathing was too slow, too controlled. "I need to call someone," I said, trying to stay calm but my voice trembling now. I reached for my phone, but before I could unlock it, his grip on my arm tightened, and he pulled me toward his car. "No, you don't need to do that," he said in a low, menacing tone. "Just come with me, and it'll be fine." I tried to pull away, but he was stronger than I expected. His hold was firm, and I couldn't break free. Panic surged in me, and every instinct told me to run. But before I could make any kind of move, I felt a sharp tug on my arm, and then, like a switch had flipped, I realized he wasn't planning to let me go. This wasn't a traffic stop. This was a trap. He pushed me toward his car, and that's when the full realization hit me. The man wasn't a cop. He wasn't anything like one. He didn't have a badge, he didn't have a radio, and his car wasn't an official police vehicle. It looked like a plain black sedan, just another random car in the night. I kicked and screamed, finally managing to pull my arm free. I didn't know what else to do. I was terrified. The car behind him was parked too far to reach for help, and the road was completely empty. No one would hear me. My mind raced, and everything seemed to slow down, but in that moment, I knew I had to get away. I took a deep breath, ignored the pounding of my heart in my ears, and ran. I didn't look back. I didn't care about anything except getting to safety. I sprinted as fast as I could, my feet hitting the asphalt harder with each step. The sound of his voice calling after me was distant now, but I could feel his eyes on me. I didn't stop running until I found a well-lit gas station about a mile up the road. I ran inside, gasping for breath, and told the clerk what had happened. He immediately called the police. When they arrived, they took my statement, and I found out that there had been reports of people being targeted by fake officers in that area for weeks. I couldn't believe it. They never found the man. The car was gone by the time the police got to the scene, and the only thing they could do was take my report. But I couldn't shake the image of his eyes, that cold look in his gaze, and the way he gripped my arm. I still get chills thinking about it. I haven't driven at night alone since that incident. I don't know who he was or what he wanted, but I'm just thankful that I got away. It still haunts me, though. The fact that I was so close to something terrible happening, and I didn't even see it coming. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway, just a small group of us heading out to the woods for some camping. We were a tight-knit group of 4 friends who had been hanging out together since college. The plan was to hike, set up camp, and just enjoy the quiet of the forest. No phones, no distractions, just us in nature. We had been hiking for a few hours, making our way along an unfamiliar trail we found on a map. The weather had been nice, the kind of cool breeze that makes the woods smell fresh. There wasn't much talk as we walked, just the sound of our boots crunching on the dirt and the occasional laugh about something stupid. We all agreed that this was the kind of trip we needed, peaceful and undisturbed. Then we came across the cabin. It wasn't marked on the trail map, which was odd. It wasn't even in good condition. The roof was sagging in some places, and there were a few windows that were boarded up, but there was no mistaking it. This place had been abandoned for a while. There was no road leading to it, no signs of people around, just trees and silence. At first, we all thought it was just an old hunting cabin or maybe some kind of relic from years ago. It wasn't uncommon to find these kinds of things when you ventured into the woods. But then, we noticed something strange. There was a new, fresh-looking trail of footprints leading up to the porch. It wasn't a large set, just a single pair of boots, maybe a man's, making their way in and out of the cabin. I don't know why, but none of us decided to turn around right then. Instead, we stood there for a few moments, looking at each other. It was like we all had the same idea, that we should check it out. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was because we were tired and the cabin looked like a perfect place to rest for a while. Whatever it was, we moved closer. As we approached, the creaky wooden steps groaned beneath our weight, and one of the boards nearly snapped. The air around the cabin felt colder, but it wasn't the kind of cold that comes from a shift in temperature. It was more of an uncomfortable chill that seemed to seep into your bones. We joked about it at first, saying it was just the old cabin giving off strange vibes, but there was something about it that felt wrong. We knocked on the door, half expecting no one to answer. But when no one responded, we opened it slowly, half expecting the hinges to squeak, but it didn't. It was a soft, almost deliberate creak. The inside was dark, dust settling on the furniture and wooden floors. The place looked abandoned for sure, but there was something that didn't sit right. There was an odd smell, a mix of stale air and something earthy, like wet dirt. The furniture was sparse, an old couch covered in a gray sheet, a coffee table with some old magazines, a chair near the window that looked out toward the trees. It was empty, except for one detail, a backpack sitting on the floor, near the door. It was open, as though someone had just been there and left in a hurry. We all stood there for a while, not really knowing what to say. I could feel my heart beating in my chest, but I didn't want to be the first to admit that something felt off. Then one of my friends, Chris, picked up the backpack. He opened it, rummaging through the contents. "Hey, check this out," he said. We all crowded around. Inside the bag, there were a few sets of clothes, a flashlight, a couple of water bottles, and what looked like a few empty cans of food. But there was something else, something that made my stomach drop. Tucked in between the cans was a thick rope, and next to that, a half-empty bottle of something that smelled like alcohol. Chris pulled his hand back quickly, and for the first time, we all looked at each other with a shared realization this wasn't just an abandoned cabin. Someone had been living here recently. It was all too recent. "I think we should leave," Sarah said quietly, her voice shaking. She was usually the most adventurous of us, always the one encouraging us to take risks. But now, even she looked unnerved. We didn't argue. We quickly made our way back to the door, but when we got to the porch, we heard something, a faint sound from the woods behind the cabin. A snap of a twig, followed by a slow, steady footstep. We froze. I didn't even have to look at the others to know they were thinking the same thing. Someone was out there. And they knew we were here. "Let's go." "Now," I said, my voice a little too sharp. We turned to leave, but then the door to the cabin slammed shut behind us, like it had been pushed by an invisible hand. Everyone jumped. We ran down the stairs, and as we rounded the corner of the cabin, we saw a figure standing in the woods, just out of reach of the trees. It was too dark to make out his face, but his figure was unmistakable, tall, with a dark jacket and what looked like a pair of boots. I don't know who moved first, whether it was me or one of the others, but we didn't waste a second. We ran in the opposite direction, towards the trees, not even looking back to see if he was following. We didn't need to. The sounds of the footsteps behind us were enough to make us push harder, faster. We didn't stop until we reached the trail again, and even then, we kept running. We didn't speak to each other at first, just breathing heavily, but eventually, when we stopped to catch our breath, we realized how close we had been to something terrible. We made it back to the car without further incident. As we drove away, none of us said much. I think we were all too shaken, too scared to speak about what had just happened. The cabin, the backpack, the figure in the woods, it didn't make sense. But we all knew one thing: someone had been living there, and they weren't far away. I don't know who they were, or what they intended to do, but I'll never forget the look in the man's eyes, the same kind of coldness that made my blood run cold. I'm just thankful we made it out alive. And I'll never go camping again without wondering if someone's watching me from the woods. I never thought I'd be writing something like this. I've always loved my dog. Her name's Bella, a small but energetic little thing, a mix of terrier and something else, I think. She was always by my side, whether I was out for a walk or curled up on the couch watching TV. She was just my constant, you know? So, when she went missing, it felt like I had lost a part of myself. It all started one Tuesday afternoon. I had just finished work, and as usual, I let Bella out in the backyard. We lived in a quiet neighborhood, and the backyard was fenced in. She never strayed far, just sniffing around the yard, chasing a few squirrels, maybe barking at the neighbors as they walked by. So, when I went inside to grab something to drink, I didn't think anything of it. When I went back outside about 10 minutes later, Bella was gone. I didn't panic at first. I thought maybe she had squeezed through the fence somehow or wandered into the front yard. I checked there, called her name, and when she didn't come, I went out into the street, asking anyone nearby if they'd seen her. A couple of neighbors told me they hadn't seen her, but that didn't mean much. She was a quiet dog, so maybe they just didn't notice. By sunset, I was getting worried. I posted on the local neighborhood Facebook group, asking if anyone had seen her. I drove around the block a few times, hoping to see her running around or just sitting by someone's door, like she sometimes did when she was waiting for me to come home. It wasn't until later that night when I started feeling like something was wrong. The next day, I woke up early, hoping to catch Bella wandering around like she sometimes did. But nothing. By then, I was frantic. I printed out flyers, asked around, even went door to door to my neighbors. No one had seen her, and no one had any idea where she could have gone. It was about 2 days after she went missing that I started noticing something odd. There was a neighbor down the street, Mr. Porter. He was a quiet guy, lived alone, and didn't really talk to anyone much. I'd always waved to him when I passed by, but that was about it. I had never really had any reason to think about him until now. I don't know why, but something about the way he acted caught my attention. For the past 2 days, whenever I passed his house, I noticed that his blinds were always pulled tight. It wasn't like him to keep his windows covered. He usually had them open, letting in the light. And every time I walked by, I could see the shadow of him moving inside, like he was standing still, just watching. I don't know what exactly made me suspicious, but the feeling only grew. So, on the 3rd day, after exhausting every other option, I decided to stop by his house. I had to know if he'd seen anything or heard anything about Bella. I had no plan beyond just asking, but the way he was acting made me uneasy, so I thought maybe it was worth a shot. I knocked on his door. No answer. I knocked again, a little louder this time. Still nothing. I started to turn around, figuring I'd leave a note and try again later, but then I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. "Hello?" Mr. Porter's voice startled me. I turned around quickly, and he was standing there, looking at me from the doorway. He had a strange expression on his face, almost like he was trying to hide something, or maybe it was just my nerves getting to me. "I'm sorry to bother you, Mr. Porter," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "But I was wondering if you'd seen my dog, Bella. She's been missing for a few days." He paused for a moment before answering, which felt a little too long. "No, I haven't seen anything," he said, his eyes flicking down to the ground. "Sorry to hear that. You should try the animal shelter." I nodded, thinking maybe I had just read into his behavior. People are weird sometimes, right? But as I was about to leave, something made me hesitate. "Wait," I said, not knowing exactly what made me ask, "is there any chance I could take a quick look around your yard? I'm just trying to track down where she might have gone." Mr. Porter's expression changed. He looked uncomfortable, but after a long, awkward silence, he finally said, "Sure, I guess. But there's really no reason to." Before he could finish his sentence, I saw something in the corner of my eye. A shadow. The shadow of something small, moving behind the thick hedge that separated his backyard from the house. "Is that?" I started, but he quickly shut the door behind him, cutting me off. "I wouldn't bother," he said, his voice low and tense now. "You can't just go peeking around people's property." At that moment, I could feel my heart rate pick up. Something wasn't right. Why was he acting like that? Why didn't he want me to look behind the hedge? "I'll be quick," I said, not waiting for him to stop me. I didn't know what was going on, but everything inside me screamed that I needed to see what was behind that hedge. I walked around to the side of his house, and when I pushed through the bushes, my breath caught in my throat. Bella was there, but she wasn't free. She was locked in a small cage, barely big enough for her to move around in. Her fur was matted, and she was trembling, looking up at me with big, scared eyes. My heart stopped for a moment as I rushed over to the cage. "Bella," I whispered, my voice breaking. "Oh my God, Bella." Before I could reach for the latch to open the cage, I heard Mr. Porter behind me, his voice dangerously calm. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." I turned around, and there he was, standing at the corner of the house, his arms crossed, blocking my way back. "You need to leave," he said, his voice cold now. I don't like being disturbed. I was frozen for a second, unsure of what to do. My dog was right there, and I couldn't just leave her. But I also had no idea what Mr. Porter was capable of. I took a deep breath and backed away slowly, my hand still reaching for the cage. "I'm calling the cops," I said, my voice trembling. He didn't move, but he didn't stop me either. I turned and ran back to my house, barely able to breathe with the shock and fear. As soon as I was inside, I dialed 911. It felt like hours until the police finally arrived, but when they did, they went to his house, and soon enough, they came back with Bella, safe but terrified. Mr. Porter was arrested, and it turned out that he'd been keeping her and other pets locked up in his house for months, taking them from yards when people weren't paying attention. He wasn't even the least bit remorseful when the police questioned him. I've never felt so shaken in my life, and I'll never understand why he did it or why he chose my Bella. But I'm just so grateful that I trusted my gut that day. Bella's home now, and I'll never take my eyes off her again. I hope I never run into anyone like Mr. Porter again. I've worked the night shift at St. Margaret's Hospital for almost 2 years, and it's never been anything out of the ordinary. Sure, the night shift can be slow, sometimes even eerie, with fewer staff and fewer patients. But you get used to it. The routine, the silence, the dim lighting, all of it. You learn to move through the quiet halls without thinking too much about it. But this past month, something changed. Something that made me start questioning everything. It started with the missing medical records. At first, I thought it was just me being forgetful. I'd file a chart, go back to check on a patient, and then realize I'd left something behind. But over time, it wasn't just 1 or 2 records, it was entire files, crucial ones. The kind you need to monitor a patient's care. Every time I went to grab one, it was gone. I checked the drawers, the filing cabinets, the computer, but nothing. I didn't mention anything at first, thinking maybe someone else had misplaced them, or I had simply put them somewhere without realizing it. But then it started happening with other things. Missing equipment, syringes, medication. It was as though something or someone was taking things. And the weirdest part? Every time I asked my colleagues about it, they seemed just as confused as I was. One night, things took a much darker turn. It was around 3 a.m., a quiet time when most patients were asleep, and there weren't many staff around. I had just checked on the last few rooms of my floor when I noticed that Dr. Patterson, the head of our unit, was walking down the hall. Now, Patterson was a bit of a strange one, distant, always a little too formal, and he never worked nights. He'd always been a day doctor, so it was odd to see him at this hour. "Dr. Patterson?" I called out as he passed the nurse's station, just to be polite. He stopped for a second, then turned to me with a blank look. "Oh, it's you, Nurse Williams. How's everything tonight?" His voice sounded fine, but there was something off about it, like he wasn't entirely aware of where he was. "It's going all right. Everything under control?" I asked, trying to make conversation. He nodded slowly, almost too slowly. "Yes. Everything is fine. Everything is always fine here." It was a strange thing to say, considering how late it was and how empty the hallways felt. But I didn't think much of it at the time. The next time I saw him, it was a few hours later. I had just finished my rounds and was sitting at the desk, catching up on some paperwork. I heard the sound of footsteps approaching, soft but deliberate. I looked up, expecting to see one of the night staff coming through. But it was Dr. Patterson again, walking with that same eerie calmness, his eyes scanning the hallway as if looking for something or someone. This time, I couldn't help myself. "Dr. Patterson, is everything okay?" I asked, a little too forcefully. He turned to look at me, and his eyes seemed to flicker for a moment, like he wasn't really seeing me. He gave a small smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Everything is fine. You should check on room 205. The patient in there seems restless," he said. His voice was almost mechanical, like he was repeating something he'd been told to say. I gave him a nod, but something in my gut told me something was very wrong. I wasn't sure why, but I felt an overwhelming urge to check the patient in 205. So I did. When I reached the door, I felt a cold chill. The lights in the room were dimmed, and there was no sound coming from inside. The patient, an elderly woman named Mrs. Hawkins, had been admitted for severe complications due to a stroke. She was never very mobile and often slept through the night. But when I opened the door, she wasn't in the bed. I checked the bathroom. Nothing. I checked under the bed, behind the curtains. Still nothing. But when I looked down at the floor near the window, I saw something strange, a small smear of blood leading from the bed toward the door. Panic set in. I immediately checked the security footage, but the cameras outside the room had been disabled. I felt my pulse quicken. How could the cameras have been turned off? And why would they even be disabled at all? I went straight to the head nurse's office, but she was nowhere to be found. It was just me, and the feeling that something was seriously wrong, and I couldn't shake it. I rushed back to the nurse's station, where I found another nurse, Carla. She looked just as confused as I felt. "I think Dr. Patterson has been doing something to the patients," I said quickly, my voice trembling. "Mrs. Hawkins is missing, and the cameras, Carla, something is wrong." Carla froze, staring at me. "What are you talking about? Are you sure?" "Check room 205, I urged. "I don't think she left on her own. There's blood on the floor, and I can't find her anywhere." She seemed reluctant, but she finally nodded, and we both went to room 205 together. When we got there, we saw the same thing. The room was empty, the bed undisturbed, and the blood smear on the floor. But then, when Carla turned to me, her face paled. "Where is Dr. Patterson?" I looked around. He wasn't there, but I had just seen him a moment ago. I felt a sudden, sharp sense of dread. Carla and I decided to check the hospital's basement. We didn't say a word as we descended the stairs, but the deeper we went, the heavier the air seemed to get. The basement was where all the medical waste and old equipment was stored. It was also the last place I wanted to be at 4 a.m., but something in my gut told me to check. We turned the corner to find Dr. Patterson standing by a door, a heavy metal door I had never noticed before. His back was to us. He was mumbling to himself, as if he were talking to someone. "Dr. Patterson?" I called out. He didn't respond. I looked at Carla, and she looked back at me, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. Slowly, I approached him, and I could feel the air growing colder. "Dr. Patterson, what's going on?" I asked again. This time, he turned slowly to face me, his eyes dark, empty. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. Behind him, the door creaked open. I didn't wait for him to move. I grabbed Carla's arm and pulled her back toward the stairs, ignoring the scream that built up in my throat. We ran out of the basement, all the way to the front desk, and the first thing I did was call 911. When the police arrived, they searched the basement and found a small, hidden room. Inside, there were medical records, patients' belongings, and enough evidence to show that Dr. Patterson had been conducting some sort of illegal experiment. It didn't make sense. He was manipulating patients' files, drugging them, and somehow making them disappear. He had been using the cover of the night shift to do whatever he was doing down there. I never went back to work after that. The hospital was investigated, but I don't know if anything truly came of it. I didn't stick around to find out. I couldn't. I don't know what happened to Dr. Patterson. I never heard his name again, but every time I see the hospital on the news, I wonder if someone else will find out what he was doing. I don't think I'll ever understand what happened that night, but I know this: I'll never forget the cold emptiness in his eyes. I'll start by saying I'm not the type to get spooked easily. I've always thought of myself as someone who keeps their head on straight, especially in uncomfortable situations. But that night in the parking garage, it still messes with me. It was a Friday, around 9:30 p.m. I'd been at the office late finishing up some last-minute work and figured I'd grab a bite to eat before heading home. I parked my car in the usual spot at the underground garage. It's not the most convenient place in the world, but it's cheap and always pretty empty at night. I didn't think much of it when I parked and walked to the elevator to head out for dinner. When I got back about an hour later, the garage was pretty quiet, just like it usually is. The lights flickered a little, but nothing too unusual. I walked down the row of cars, heading toward my space when I saw it. A dark sedan parked directly in front of my car, blocking me in. It was the only car around, and I could tell right away that something felt off. I figured it was just someone who didn't know how to park properly, or maybe they just left it there temporarily. But as I got closer, I noticed the person in the driver's seat. The lights from the overhead lamps caught the outline of the person, and it was clear they weren't just sitting in their car, waiting for someone. They were staring straight ahead, completely still. I thought maybe they were just on their phone or something, but there was something unsettling about it. They hadn't moved an inch since I'd parked. At first, I didn't think much of it. I stood there for a moment, looking at the car, wondering if I should say something. But I decided to just wait it out. Maybe they'd move or leave soon. But as I stood there, I realized the person didn't even seem to notice me. There was no shift, no glance in my direction, nothing. I cleared my throat and took a few steps closer, hoping they'd react. But they didn't. The car's windows were tinted dark enough that I couldn't make out any details about the person. I felt a little stupid, standing there, staring at a car. But I couldn't help it. The whole thing just didn't sit right. After a minute or so, I finally knocked on the window. I figured they'd open the door and apologize or explain themselves. But instead, the person just shifted slightly in their seat. Not enough to look at me, but I saw their head move, just a bit. I felt a cold prickle on the back of my neck. This wasn't right. I stood there for a second, unsure what to do. I knocked again, a little louder. Still no response. Something in me snapped, and I decided to walk around the car. As I moved past the front of the sedan, I saw the rearview mirror adjust, and I froze. The person was now looking directly at me through the rearview mirror. But they didn't move. Their eyes stayed locked with mine, unblinking, like they were waiting for me to make a move. I took a step back, my stomach dropping. Something about the way they looked at me, it was off. Like they didn't even recognize me as a person. More like I was a threat. I turned around and walked briskly back toward my car. I wasn't about to stick around and see what this person was up to. I had enough of a gut feeling to know that something wasn't right. As I walked back to the front of my car, I glanced back, just to check. The sedan was still there, the person still watching me through the mirror. When I got to my car, I pulled my keys out of my pocket and tried to unlock it, but the lock wouldn't disengage. I pressed the button again and again, but nothing happened. The damn thing wouldn't open. That's when I realized my heart was pounding. I was sweating now, feeling a panic building in my chest. I reached for the handle, yanked it, and still nothing. It wouldn't budge. I spun around and looked back at the sedan. The person in the car hadn't moved, but now their head was tilted slightly to the side, like they were studying me. I swear I felt a chill crawl up my spine. The more I stood there, the more I felt like I was caught in some kind of trap, with no way out. I didn't know what to do. Should I call the police? Should I confront them? My phone was still in my pocket, but I didn't want to take my eyes off the car. If I made a move, who knew what could happen? Finally, I decided to try the old-school approach. I walked around the back of my car, eyes locked on the sedan, and went to the rear door. I yanked it open, jumped inside, and locked the door behind me. I threw my keys in the ignition and tried to start the engine. Nothing. I turned it again, this time harder. And then, thank God, it roared to life. I didn't even think. I slammed the car in reverse and floored the gas. As I did, I caught one last look at the sedan through the rearview mirror. The person was still sitting there, perfectly still, staring after me. I couldn't get out of that garage fast enough. I'm not sure what they wanted or what was going on, but I wasn't going to stick around to find out. When I finally pulled out onto the street and got back to the main road, I felt like I could breathe again, but the whole thing stuck with me. I don't know who that person was or what their intentions were, but the way they acted, the way they didn't move, didn't react. I've never felt so trapped in my life. It wasn't until I got home and sat down that I realized just how close I'd come to being caught in something much worse. I haven't gone back to that parking garage since. Every time I pass by, I feel a knot in my stomach. I can't shake the feeling that I was a target, and that person was waiting for the right moment. I don't know if they followed me out or if they're still down there, but I don't think I'll ever be able to forget those eyes in the rearview mirror. I had been living in my house for a couple of years when I decided it was time for a change. The kitchen was outdated, and the bathroom needed work. I'd heard about a contractor from a friend who had done some remodeling in her home and recommended him. He seemed professional when we met, and his references checked out. I felt comfortable hiring him to do the job. I work long hours, so I figured it would be easier for him to come by during the day while I was at work. He was going to handle everything, the demo, the construction, and all the finishing touches. I trusted him to do a good job, but I didn't think much of it when I left for work every day. I was busy, and I had other things on my mind. The first few days went smoothly. He showed up early, worked long hours, and left when I got home. The house looked like a mess with all the construction, but I figured that was just part of the process. After a week or so, the kitchen cabinets were out, the counters were being replaced, and the walls had been stripped down. It was messy, but it was clear he was making progress. But then things started to feel off. I had a feeling that something wasn't right when I came home one evening and found my bedroom door slightly open. I had never left it open, and it wasn't like I had forgotten. I'm not someone who leaves doors open unless I'm in and out of a room. The rest of the house was just as I had left it, so I didn't think much of it at the time. The next day, I came home and found the same thing. My bedroom door was ajar, and I could have sworn I had closed it. I started to feel uneasy but told myself I was just being paranoid. Maybe I was forgetful. Maybe the door didn't latch properly, or maybe I had left it open without thinking. I tried to dismiss it, but it kept happening. Every day, I'd come home to find my bedroom door open, and sometimes other rooms felt slightly different. The couch cushions were arranged differently, or a picture frame that I hadn't touched was crooked. Little things that didn't make sense. I wasn't sure if I was imagining it or if something strange was really going on. But every time I walked into the house, I felt a chill in the air, like someone else had been there. Then one evening, I had an idea. I'd started working from home occasionally, so I decided to stay in the house and keep an eye on things. I made sure to close my bedroom door before I left for work. I wanted to see if anything changed while I was gone. That evening, when I came home, I opened the door slowly, and my stomach dropped. It was open. Wide open. I stood there, frozen, trying to figure out what was going on. I had clearly locked it before leaving, and now it was wide open, just like the other times. I went inside, checking for anything else that was out of place. That's when I noticed the camera. It was small, hidden on the corner of the room, nearly impossible to see unless you were specifically looking for it. I felt sick. My hands were shaking. My first thought was to call the police, but I didn't want to jump to conclusions. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe it wasn't what I thought it was. But I knew I had to get confirmation before doing anything drastic. The next morning, I made sure to leave the camera exactly where it was. I left for work as usual, but this time I went to the local store and bought a few things. I wasn't sure what I was planning to do, but I had to know. I wanted to see if there were more cameras in the house. I came back that evening, pretending everything was normal. I went straight to my bedroom and checked the camera again. Sure enough, it had been moved. The angle was slightly different, as though someone had been adjusting it while I was gone. I felt like I couldn't breathe. I was being watched. I was sure of it now. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know who to trust. I knew I couldn't confront him just yet. What if he denied it? What if it escalated? I had to be careful. But I had no idea how deep this had gone or how long it had been going on. I knew he'd been in my house when I wasn't there, but I couldn't figure out how long this had been happening. The next day, I took the camera to a friend who worked in tech. I told her what had been happening and showed her the footage. It was unmistakable. He had been recording me. He had been watching my every move when I was at home, when I was alone. My worst fears were coming true. He had been in my personal space, invading my privacy for God knows how long. I called the police that night. I told them everything. They came to the house, and we looked through the footage together. There were hours of recordings, me walking around the house, sitting on the couch, making dinner, even moments when I was changing clothes. I felt disgusted, violated, like everything I had was no longer mine. The worst part was not knowing how long he'd been doing this. How many times had he watched me when I was completely unaware? The police didn't waste any time. They went to his office, and they found more cameras, more hidden equipment. Apparently, he had been doing this to other clients as well. I couldn't believe it. I felt like I had been living in a nightmare. Someone I had trusted to do work in my house had turned out to be someone I should have never let through my door. I never saw him again after that day. I don't know what happened to him, but I know he was arrested and charged with multiple offenses. It's been months now, and I still don't feel safe in my own house. I've had all the locks changed and the security system upgraded. But no matter what I do, I can't stop feeling like I'm being watched. Like I'm never really alone. I've been trying to move on, but some days it's harder than others. I still check my bedroom door, even though I know it's locked. And sometimes, I wonder how many people out there are doing the same thing he did to me, hiding in plain sight. I didn't think much about my new roommate at first. I had just moved to college, and after weeks of anxiety over finding a place to live, I finally found someone who seemed nice enough. Her name was Lauren, and she was a few years older than me. She'd been at the university for a while, so I thought it would be helpful to have someone more experienced around. She was friendly, always asking how my day was going and offering to help when I looked stressed. We would have dinner together occasionally and talk about everything and nothing. For the first few weeks, it was fine. But things started to shift. It started with small, strange things. I'd come back to the room after class, and my things would be moved around. At first, I thought maybe I was just being forgetful. Maybe I'd left my books on the wrong side of the desk or something. But then it kept happening. I'd leave my textbook on my bed, and when I returned, it would be on the desk, perfectly arranged as if I'd been using it there all along. And it wasn't just my books. It was my clothes, my phone charger, even the way I had arranged my side of the room. It wasn't malicious, exactly, just strange. Unsettling. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe Lauren was just more organized than me, or maybe I was sleep deprived and not paying enough attention. Then came the rumors. I first heard about them when I was sitting with a couple of friends in the common area. We were just chatting, nothing serious, when one of them, Anna, who I didn't know too well, looked at me with a weird look and said, "I heard you're not exactly easy to live with. Something about you being messy?" I froze. Messy? That's not even true. I keep my stuff organized. I don't make a mess. I had no idea what she was talking about. I laughed awkwardly, brushing it off, but it stayed with me. Later that day, another friend mentioned something about me being weirdly distant and not very social. That made even less sense. I was always the one reaching out to people, inviting them over, trying to make connections. I was new to the school. I was trying to make friends, not push people away. At that point, I started getting a little paranoid. What if someone had been saying things about me? What if I had somehow offended people without realizing it? But I didn't think too much about it. People talk. I assumed it would blow over. But it didn't. The rumors grew worse. More people seemed to know about my supposed social issues and messiness. I heard things whispered behind my back, but no one ever said anything to my face. It was always just small comments that didn't seem to make sense. One day, I overheard a group of girls talking about me in the hall. They were whispering, but I could hear bits of their conversation. I heard she's really hard to live with, doesn't clean up after herself. I couldn't believe it. I hadn't even said a word about any of this to anyone. It was all coming from somewhere, and it didn't make sense. The final straw came a few weeks later when I found out my laptop had gone missing. I keep my laptop locked in my drawer when I'm not using it, and when I got home from class one afternoon, it was gone. At first, I thought maybe I had just forgotten where I'd put it. I checked everywhere, moved everything around, even asked Lauren if she had seen it. She seemed a little too surprised when I asked her about it, like she was trying to seem innocent. She said she hadn't seen it and that maybe I'd misplaced it. But it was gone for good. I went to the campus security, filed a report, but the whole time I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. And the more I thought about it, the more I began to realize just how much weird stuff had been happening that I had ignored or brushed off. Lauren had been acting a little more distant than usual. She would sometimes leave the room for hours without telling me where she was going. She was always super careful to avoid eye contact, and when we did talk, it felt off. But it wasn't until I went through her things that I realized just how much she had been manipulating everything. I don't know what drove me to do it. Maybe it was a mixture of fear and frustration, but one afternoon, I waited until Lauren was out of the apartment, and I went through her side of the room. I didn't find anything incriminating at first, just the usual personal stuff. But when I opened her drawer, I saw a bunch of photos of me, taken from different angles, some of them candid, some of them when I had no idea someone was watching. There were more than a few, and my heart sank. I felt sick to my stomach. But it wasn't just that. There were also texts between her and a group of people from my classes, all of them talking about me. She had been spreading rumors about me, things I never said, things I hadn't even thought about. It was clear now. She had been sabotaging me. Sabotaging my life, my relationships, everything. She'd been orchestrating it all from behind the scenes, planting seeds of doubt, feeding lies, and making sure everyone around me thought I was some kind of mess. I didn't know what to do. How could someone who seemed so friendly, so normal, be capable of such manipulation? I didn't feel safe anymore. I wanted to confront her, but I was afraid of what she would do. I couldn't even trust the people around me because she had clearly gotten to them too. She had made sure I would be isolated. The next day, I packed my things while she was out. I didn't even leave a note. I just left. I didn't want to be around her anymore. I went to the housing office and requested to be moved into a new room, a new apartment anywhere far away from her. I didn't care what it took. I don't know if she ever found out that I had gone through her things or that I had discovered the truth. I didn't stick around long enough to find out. I never saw her again after that, but I'm sure she knew something was up when I vanished without a word. I didn't want to be near her. Not after everything. It's been months since I moved out, and I'm still trying to rebuild my social life. The damage she caused wasn't just to my reputation. It was my trust. It was my sense of security. I don't know what motivated her to do all of it, but I'll never forget the feeling of realizing that someone I had lived with, someone who seemed kind, had been secretly tearing my life apart. I don't know if I'll ever be able to trust someone that easily again.